Members, although I'm told that Senator Hollingsworth and Senator Weiland will not be joining us today, so we're going to be, for the purposes of Senator Romero's bill, will be just enough for quorum, hopefully, at some point. So with that, Senator Romero, would you like to come forward and present your item, SB 956? Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm here today with Senate Bill 956, and this is part of the package that the Pro Tem has unveiled with respect to looking at jobs creation. And I think we're not only looking at jobs creation, but the enhancement of the type of job and career pathways that we want to see in California. Let me begin by accepting and thanking the committee analysis and accepting the proposed amendments that are reflected on page 3. I would accept those as an author's amendment. The bill specifically, Senate Bill 956, it redirects $5 million of the federal WIA funds, the Workforce Investment Act WIA funds, to the California Paraprofessional Teacher Training Program. And the funds would come from the governor's 15% discretionary fund within the WIA allocation. Why would we want to do something like this? Well, as we know, the WIA funds are there to address urgency issues, the need for newly hired teachers, trained teachers. This bill is consistent with the purposes of the federal law, which seeks to direct resources to sectors of the greatest need. We know that since 1990, the California Paraprofessional Teacher Training Program has recruited basically from within. They've recruited school paraprofessionals to participate in local career ladders, enabling them to become certified classroom teachers in public schools. This is a successful program. To date, it has created over 5,000 credentialed teachers. And according to the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, this is what's so exciting about the success of this program, the retention rate for teachers coming out of this program, participating in this program, is 85%. 85% retention rate. If we look at even teachers who come out of the traditional programs, that retention rate is 50%. So there is something going on in this program that is very dynamic. It's very exciting. To me, it just makes sense. We essentially are growing our own. These are already individuals who are on the campus, on the site, participating. They know the neighborhood. They know the community. They know the kids. They know how to address the needs. And it is a step up, enhancing and growing from within. So I think that fabulous 85% retention rate is in part just showing the longevity of commitment and the desire to step forward and meet the needs of the children in the schools. The other really good thing I think about this program is that the demographics of the teachers coming out of this program tracks almost exactly the ethnic makeup of California's student population. 64% of the participants are students of color and 51% are multilingual. This program has also addressed the severe shortage of math and science teachers by focusing recruitment efforts on paraprofessionals seeking certificates to teach science, mathematics, and special education students. So overall, we think this is a win-win, and we would respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Okay. Witnesses in support.
Yes, good morning. Michelle Castro with the Service Employees International Union. I think Senator Romero made all of the key points. SEIU was the original sponsor of the Roberti bill and then the subsequent legislation, the Jack Scott bill, there was a Solis bill, so we're very invested in the program. Just two more key points I want to make, just specific to Los Angeles Unified. Los Angeles Unified, 7% of their entire teaching workforce has come through this program, and they have stayed. Many have gone on to become principals in the district, and they have increased their minority teacher population by 15%, which is even more reflective of their own student population. So we think it's a very good program, worth investing in, and we ask for your aye vote. Thank you.
Okay. Other witnesses in support? Any witnesses in opposition? Any comments from Senator Leno?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Seems like a very reasonable use of this $5 million. I don't see it in the analysis. Do you know what percentage of the 15% discretionary is the $5 million? Do you know how much that will leave in dollars?
I don't have that number. Do you?
No, I don't know.
And traditionally, is the 15% expended each year by the governor in discretionary use, and do we know how it's typically used? So, because we're going to be taking it from one use to another, just wondering what we're going to be leaving behind.
I wouldn't have that information today.
Okay.
I mean, we can look forward and hopefully as we go forward,
Yeah.
provide that information as we continue to discuss this, but I don't have that information today.
I'm told by our top-notch staff that it varies from year to year, depending on what we decide. Senator DeCheney may know better.
One of the issues with this bill, I think, is exactly that. I mean, there's two big questions I had. I apologize for being a little late, but we have tried over the last few years consistently to give legislative direction to how to spend that money. We have used it for some really important things like parolees and CalWorks, and have been able to do that the last few years to make up for some other shortcomings. And one of my concerns is that there is now a strategic plan for Workforce Investment Act that is going forward, and I don't know what it does to that, to take money from WIA now, this early in the game, before we know exactly what we're dealing with. And those numbers do change every year depending on what the federal government does. They haven't reauthorized the Workforce Investment Act in the last 10 years, although they were supposed to, and so we're sort of going along, and we've gotten ERA funds, and it's gotten a little confused, but a lot of it's been used the last couple of years for green jobs. There's a Green Jobs Council. WIA money's being used to do some of those things, renewable energy projects and things that get stuff on the ground quickly, and I think one of the concerns is using WIA money right now, at least for things that might be long-term. This is a good program. There's nothing, I mean, the paraprofessional program's been a good program all the way along. But there are two other problems that I don't know if anybody's figured out the answers to yet. One is whether this is essentially supplanting Prop 98 money, and that's illegal.
Yeah, this is not supplanting. We don't believe that Prop 98 would be
How is it not doing that? This is a categorical program that was given flexibility last year to districts to do or not do under their flexibility, their flex categoricals, and they've funded it in the past through 98.
I'm not sure it's a categorical because the money goes entirely through the CTC, and then the school districts apply for the funds through the CTC. So I'm not sure if it's technically a categorical or not.
It's a separate revenue stream of federal money, and it does.
Well, what money went to it before? Because it was 98 money, if I recall.
It is state general fund money, but I'm not sure if it counts towards the Prop 98 calculation because it's a separate line item in the budget. I don't think it's part of the categoricals. We could double check that and make sure.
That's what all categoricals were, as separate line items in the budget.
That's true, but I
lumped together last year. It's my understanding this one got lumped with all of the other ones.
We'll double
check. It's a flex program for districts.
Let's double check.
And if that's true, then this is supplanting discretions from districts and Prop 98 dollars with WIA money. So I don't know how to.
I have just a couple things, and my inclination is to support the bill, let it out, with the option of pulling it back if we can get the questions asked or any amendments, whether it goes to education. Hopefully that won't be necessary. But in addition to what Senator DeCheney's concern is, do we have any kind of indication from CTC whether they support the bill or not? So does the Commissioner on Teacher Credentialing have any position on the bill?
I haven't heard from them.
Okay. So maybe we can find that out. And then my biggest concern is just if it's completely consistent with federal law, so we don't get sideways with them. And I wonder if you've had any discussion with.
The intent in looking at the intent of WIA overall is to begin to direct resources to the most needed sector. We have seen, even if we go back in time, we have seen significant slashing to the funds in this paraprofessional teacher training program. So, I mean, at a certain extent, we're trying to build, to replenish. Mm-hmm. We've seen the success rate. Senator DeCheney, prior to you coming in, I had indicated that when we look at the retention rate of teachers in the classroom, it's 85%. Mm-hmm. It is significant, and it more so brings in sort of lifting boats of oftentimes women who maybe begin as cafeteria workers, playground aides, etc., start wanting to have the training going forward. So finding much more of multilingual, bilingual personnel wanting to move up. So
That's not the issue. The problem is that right now we're laying off teachers. So creating new ones right now, it's a timing issue. It's not that the program doesn't work, and it has been a good program, and it's one of the best ways to get teachers forward. But whether teachers are the greatest need right now in terms of job creation, I mean, the analysis indicates that they are, in fact, that we've been laying off teachers, and so these folks that are going through this program now aren't getting placed. And I thought it said somewhere in the analysis that this was Tier 3 categorical, but I'm not finding that spot.
It's on page 3, Senator Duchesne. So I think what you're hearing, Senator, is some concerns from myself and Senator Duchesne. I think an indication from you'll continue to have your staff, both in education and your staff who are staffing the bill, work with us and see if we can remedy some of those concerns. And I think we're all in support of the general idea, but...
I'd rather... I mean, is there some urgency to this? I mean, I don't know why we wouldn't hold it over and try to figure this out and find the appropriate sorts of funding. I think this program should be funded, but I'm a little concerned about moving it forward until we've solved some of those issues.
Senator Romero.
we often talk about works in progress. I think we are trying to look at teacher training. And I think this is an important demonstration that we are interested in meeting the needs of a student body in California that is going to require teachers trained, competent to be in the classroom. We are all trying to look for funding for education to try to prevent cuts. This is part and parcel of it. These are federal dollars. I would ask, on good faith, move it forward. If you have questions, you can always pull it back. But I do applaud the leadership of our pro tem, including this as part of the comprehensive jobs package, focusing on the need for us to have and to continue to meet the demands of a quality teaching workforce that recognizes that some of the greatest talent comes right from our own backyard. On that school ground already, and what they need is a little bit of an additional boost, a little bit of an additional training. And if we invest those needed dollars into them, we get the retention that is remarkable for our students in California. So I would respectfully ask for an aye vote, move it forward. If you want to pull it back at some point, I'm always happy to come back.
Okay, I'll take that as your close.
Thank you.
That's okay. When we get a quorum, we'll proceed. At this point, I would just take you on your word that you will continue to work. Hopefully, we'll do it quickly. I think all of us agree with the spirit and your intention. We just want to make sure we get it right. So. With that, thank you, and when we get a quorum, we'll let you know, and we'll let you, of course, know the results.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Support and opposition?
We already went through that. There's no opposition. Okay, we'll find out. We'll take a couple of minutes, and hopefully we'll be joined by Assemblymember Monning, and we'll go on to the rest of our agenda. So, Senator Yee, we heard testimony from Senator Romero on her bill. There was some concern expressed by both Senator Cheney and I, and we heard a commitment to take the amendments from the senator and then to continue to work with our staff and the education staff on concerns that both Senator Cheney and I had. And if there are any problems at all, committee's going to call it back to this committee between now and when it's heard in education. So that.
It's double referred.
Yes.
Policy-wise.
Yes.
I mean, some of these issues could be resolved in approps, I suspect, but.
Well, my hope, and I hope you agree with me, is we get it done before that. That if it goes to education, our concerns haven't been met. I'm particularly concerned that it's consistent with federal law and the concerns you expressed. That would pull it back.
Well, and I need to
committee.
relook at the WIA. I mean, it would be very conditional on my part if we really want to move this forward. I didn't realize it was double referred. I had hoped that maybe we could hold it here and try to figure out a better way to do this, but if it's your desire to move it forward, it's very conditional on my part. I'm not sure I support this use of WIA funds. I'm very supportive of the paraprofessional program, but I'm not sure this is an appropriate use of WIA funds
and
right now.
I'm right there with you with my concerns. So the fact that we have the opportunity to work before education, not necessarily at education, but we hopefully we'll get all these things resolved, and then we won't have to pull it back. But if they aren't, then it's my intention, what I'm hearing from you, is that we'll pull it back immediately. So with that, we need to do the quorum first?
Yes.
Ask the Secretary.
Senator Mark Desaulniers.
I am here.
Desaulniers here. Senator Mark Weiland. Senator Denise Moreno Duchenne. Duchenne here. Senator Dennis Hollingsworth. Senator Mark Leno.
Here.
Leno here. Senator Leland Yee. Yee here.
Okay, do we have a motion? We have a quorum. Do we have a motion? Motion by Senator Leno. Ask the Secretary to call the roll, please.
Senator Desaulniers.
Aye.
Desaulniers, aye. Senator Weiland. Senator Duchenne.
Aye.
Duchenne, aye. Senator Hollingsworth. Senator Leno.
Aye.
Leno, aye. Senator Yee.
Aye.
Yee, aye.
So that's out 4-0. We are told that Senator Weiland and Senator Hollingsworth will not be with us, so there'll be no need to hold that open. With that, I'd like to welcome everybody to the joint hearing and move to that, and particularly welcome our colleague, the Chair of Assembly Labor, Mr. Monning. Thank you, and good morning, and to my colleagues. This is an item, and maybe I'll ask the first panel and the chair to come forward while I make just a few brief comments, and then turn it over to Assemblymember Monning, and then we'll follow with any other comments. The Occupational Safety Health Appeals Board, of course, is serves an important function in state government. It's been a concern for this committee, and since we've heard this a couple times now, one full hearing on oversight, particularly in regards to the backlog problems, some of the issues in terms of location and accessibility, and we're pleased that some of those things have been addressed, but there continue to be very serious concerns. There are concerns both by elements of the public, employees. Los Angeles Times and other media outlets have been doing stories that certainly raise concerns higher, and we have concerns. We've asked the Senate Office of Research to basically verify some of the numbers that the chair and the staff of the board have given to us, and we have some concerns with Senate Office of Research has come up with vis-a-vis some differences of numbers. So ultimately, at least in my perspective, this board and worker protection is about both worker protection and employer protection. As a person who spent 35 years of my life as an employer, when we get worker protection and workplace protection right in the first place, it saves everybody money. But we realize that there's a due process issue, and both for the employer and the employee. To be perfectly honest, I'm concerned that it at least appears that there may be a prejudice towards the employer, and that's not the way the statute is written, either in spirit or technically, and we want to make sure that you are following the letter of the law as the people's representatives to provide oversight. We hope that there's progress. I can say for myself, I hope that there continues to be progress. This isn't meant to be a gotcha hearing. This is meant to be an appropriate oversight, but I would be less than honest if I didn't say that at least my perspective as I've watched this over the last year is that there tends to be a bias. And I'm hopeful that that's not true, and we start to see it demonstrated, not just in promises and verbal assurances, but we actually see it in the performance of the board. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Monning, and then to any other committee members, and then we'll go to the first witness.
Thank you very much, Senator DeSaulnier, for this opportunity to participate in today's hearing. I know that your committee and the Senate Rules Committee have been looking into some of these issues for some time. I know that the Sondre Swanson bill from 2008, AB 537, raised many of the same issues that are still being discussed in relation to this board. These are not new issues. I'm very pleased that the legislature is exercising its ongoing oversight responsibility to follow up on these issues in a comprehensive and detailed manner. I believe that a thorough examination of these issues is critical to worker health and safety in California. The laws on the books are only as effective as far as they are able to be properly enforced. This obviously involves consideration of the effectiveness and procedures of the Division of Occupational Safety and Health. Equally important, and perhaps even more important for that matter, is the ability of citations and penalties to be sustained through the appellate process. For we know that if citations are not upheld through the process, there becomes a perverse incentive to appeal any and all citations, whether the appeal is meritorious or not. And that defeats the deterrent effect of the law. So I look forward to this hearing today. I look forward to hearing what progress has been made since the last hearing, and I look forward to hearing what problems remain and how we can work together to address those problems. And I want to offer my thanks to representatives of the department for joining us today and the board, and I'm looking forward to getting educated this morning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Leno, any comments?
Proceed.
Thank you. Very succinct. Good morning, Chairwoman Traeger. It's a pleasure to see you, and the floor is yours, and then we'll go to Mr. Welsh.
Would you mind if Mr. Welsh went first?
Okay.
I can go first, but I have some slides and things. So
all right, go ahead.
It's fine with me.
It's a good way to start the meeting.
Good morning, committee chairs and members of the committee. I'm glad to be here. My name is Len Welsh, Chief of the California Division of Occupational Safety and Health, commonly known as Cal-OSHA. I have to say, I do believe we are at a historic moment in the evolution of the Cal-OSHA program. I have been a part of the program or closely following it now for almost 30 years, and never in the time I have been with the program have I seen so much sustained interest on the part of so many different important entities. First of all, the legislature. There's been sustained interest by the legislature now for better than a year, which I thoroughly appreciate. Federal OSHA is beginning now to weigh in. I've had a couple of discussions with federal OSHA officials in Washington, D.C. about the relationship between California and federal OSHA. And there's certainly, on that front, more interest than I think I've seen in my career. The media, of course, have weighed in heavily, more than usual. Even my own employees, as we all know. And another phenomenon I have noticed is that the employer community now seems much more engaged than I can remember in embracing the Cal-OSHA program as something that can be of value to them. I remember a time when there was a substantial amount of will out there to just get rid of OSHA and Cal-OSHA and the whole thing. That attitude has changed. I have seen, especially in the last 10 years, an attitude maturing into how do we make this government agency work to produce value for us? How do we make this agency work to level the playing field? How do we make sure we get quality enforcement so that we, the good actors who take the trouble to comply with regs and laws, don't get undercut by the competition that doesn't have the same attitude towards the law. And I think now, with the economy in the state it's in, and the underground economy still unfortunately more vibrant than we'd like to see it, there's increasingly a desire on the part of the employer community to see us actually enforcing and getting the competition out of the way that doesn't want to follow the laws. So, I see this as being a unique point in our history, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity now to make changes in the program that will make it more effective than it is. And I do believe, actually, that as a state plan, California is the best in the nation. In fact, I've had discussions with Dr. Michaels, the Assistant Secretary, about the prospect of California gaining permanent approval as a state plan. Right now, you may not be aware, but we only have provisional approval, as is the case with all the other state plans that have active rulemaking on their own. Most state plans basically swallow whole federal regulations and submit to federal oversight on that basis. We in California are the most aggressive in adopting our own standards, and often the standards we adopt are way out beyond what federal OSHA does or any other state plan does. Often they serve as a model to the rest of the nation. That being said, I'm not going to sit here and say that we don't have our faults. And as you also know, federal OSHA is actively engaged in an audit of Cal OSHA enforcement functions. I expect results from that audit to be in sometime in April. There's a special study being conducted of the appeals process, and that includes both the appeals board and Cal OSHA. And I view actually even those audits and studies as a good thing. I think that they're going to find that we have problems to fix. I think that we're going to fix those problems, and fixing those problems could well be the predicate on which we base a request to federal OSHA for permanent approval. One thing I think that has made the Cal OSHA program as successful as it is the fact that it has a vibrant and meaningful stakeholder process driving both enforcement and standard setting in the agency. This is a process that's been going on for decades, and it has produced some of our most aggressive standards, which have been embraced, interestingly enough, by the employer community and the labor community alike in many cases. And this is because we engage in a discussion process. We bring all the stakeholders to the table, and we explore every single issue there is to explore before we move forward. Doesn't mean we all agree. There's plenty of dissent in the background of adoption of many of our standards. But the amazing thing is that there's also quite a bit of consensus. And even when there's not consensus, most stakeholders feel that the product we produce as a result of that process has been of value. Voice has been given to all those who have an opinion on the matter. And so the product that we eventually produce, even if people disagree with it, people can agree it's worth a try and they should embrace it. And that makes a big difference. If a product is forced down people's gullets, as it were, by an agency just moving forward to do something it thinks it's right, then they will find ways to oppose it. They'll try to get bills in to oppose it. They'll file lots of appeals. They'll drag their feet one way or another to impose an initiative that we've undergone. On the other hand, if we go through a stakeholder process and we go through the path of discussion, it often is the case that people will embrace the final result, and we can move on and test that result as a true experiment and see if it works. So this, the reason I've gone to the trouble to explain this is because the third arm of our program, the Appeals Board, has now begun a similar process for the first time, as far as I know, in its history. We began that process last February, February 2009, that is, of having meetings directly between Candace Treger, the board chair, and stakeholders to discuss essential issues that go to the effectiveness, the basic effectiveness of the appeals process. And, you know, this actually is the outgrowth of discussions that were had previously in the Cal OSHA Advisory Committee meeting, which is something Cal OSHA has held for decades with stakeholders, every month or every couple of months, depending on resources. Discussions there eventually led to Candace offering to engage in a similar process with the Appeals Board. Now, I know I know a lot of folks are unhappy with the pace of progress in that forum. As I said, we began that forum in February 2009. There was a letter signed by some 47 Cal OSHA employees several months later that year complaining about issues, in fact, that we had already taken up in that stakeholder process. And I think the complaints, by the way, I think the perceptions are legitimate perceptions. I think in their experience they have had cases not come out the way they thought were fair. I think they pointed to problems that were real problems in terms of them doing their job and putting on their cases. But what I think may have been lacking a little bit was historical perspective. I know everybody in this room is familiar with the fact that we underwent several years of a backlog, which sometimes could be as long as 3 years for a case to go to hearing after being appealed. And many of the settlements that came out of resolving that backlog were not settlements anybody is proud of. I'd be the first to admit that. But that is what you get after 2.5 years have gone by. You're going to lose witnesses. You're going to lose evidence. You've got a matter on the books which has to be taken care of, but it's not going to produce a result anybody wants to see. Thankfully, we're over that backlog era, hopefully for good. And true to her word, Candace said when that backlog was gone, she would engage stakeholders in a dialogue, and she's done that ever since. The discussions, I think, understandably have begun with procedural issues. The ones surfaced in the introductory piece to this hearing today are the ones we've taken up. Matters like continuances, how does a party file for continuance, get a prompt response, and get a just result in response to their request, scheduling of hearings, amendments, things like that. And we actually, at our last stakeholder meeting, which happened about 3 weeks ago, we discussed 3 different rulemaking proposals which have been generated pretty much by consensus of all the stakeholders. I mean, this is something you don't often see, but even before discussions were beginning with the appeals board, there was pretty much total consensus behind 3 different rulemaking proposals to the appeals board. Ranging from the Chamber of Commerce on one side to a group called WorkSafe on another. We had a good discussion. We're planning to come back after having a discussion with the board members there. We got some constructive suggestions, and we'll be coming back with revised proposals. And I do expect that we will see changes made, essential changes being made to board procedure as a result of those discussions. And these are changes the board would never really be able to make unless there were stakeholder discussion. If you sit as an adjudicatory body like a court, and all you ever engage in are the cases or controversies that come before you on appeal, and you resolve issues on a case-by-case basis, you as the adjudicatory body can issue, first of all, you'll issue holdings, you might issue some dictum, you might issue some pronouncements about how, in general terms, things ought to proceed. But you're never going to be able to make the kind of progress you can make if you have an open discussion with stakeholders and give and take, so that lots of different possibilities, scenarios that might come before the board get to be discussed and played out. And this is the good thing about the fact that the board is a board and not a court. As a board, it not only can engage in public discussion, it's obligated to under the statutory mandates that govern the business of a board. So we have the opportunity with this adjudicatory body to engage in a stakeholder discussion process and actually come up with potential solutions to problems that might otherwise take years and years and years of adjudication to resolve. So I am hopeful that that process is going to continue to produce results. We don't all agree about everything. It's not a secret that I made some statements to the public about the paradigm the state of California uses to classify a violation as serious, for example, which is one of the core issues I think we're going to have to confront. Federal OSHA has weighed in. I've gotten a letter from Federal OSHA, so has Candace, saying that they think we need to revise our approach to what constitutes a serious violation. And I think we need to have some discussion of that. I can tell you that one thing that will come out of this that's already planned is adoption of what we call a director's regulation to put into place instruction to Cal OSHA, to my staff, as to how to classify a violation as serious. This is something we did in the 90s when federal OSHA said that we were not as effective as they were by not having a multi-employer citation policy. We kind of had to scratch our heads a little bit, because when you have a situation where the oversight agency is looking at the adjudicatory body and saying, well, we think their law is, not something that we can support as the oversight agency, the question becomes, well, how can Cal OSHA, or any state plan for that matter, implement a change which is going to fix that problem? In that particular case, we were not holding employers other than employers whose own employees exposed to a hazard liable for hazards that those other employers might create or control. And so we adopted by director's regulation an instruction to our staff to issue citations under this policy, which had been in effect under federal OSHA for decades but had not been adopted by California. It's the only mechanism we've been able to come up with that at least gets us down the road toward fixing a problem like that with a state plan. I think other state plans can have similar issues. So one way we're going to try to address this is to get clear instruction to our staff on how to classify a violation as serious. Some of these instructions are going to vary from appeals board case law. Some of them are actually going to embrace cases from the past that the appeals board has issued in decisions after reconsideration. And my hope is that plus some stakeholder discussion will get the board down a path, and Cal OSHA down a path, that federal OSHA will recognize as adequate under their criteria, being at least as effective in both standard setting and enforcement as federal OSHA. So this is going to be an issue we have to deal with. This is going to be a substantive issue we have to deal with this year. And I know that federal OSHA is going to be insisting that we make progress on resolving the issue. And I think that through adoption of a director's regulation and through some amount of discussion, we should be able to resolve the issue. I know that, for example, if we want to achieve permanent approval of the state plan, we're certainly going to have to see eye to eye with federal OSHA on how to go about issuing and sustaining a serious violation. So I want to just close my opening statement here by expressing my appreciation for what I've heard so far this morning, even from the committee chairs and members, that they want to see a positive outcome to the controversy we have going now, that they want to see this take place in a positive atmosphere, which I think is going to happen. It doesn't mean that we can't be frank about things that need to be discussed and addressed, but I think we need to acknowledge the progress that's been made so far. I think we need to embrace the process we have in place now, this stakeholder discussion process, which has produced results and will continue to produce results. And ultimately, if it can produce the results that people agree are substantial enough to resolve people's issues, it'll be the most effective and efficient way to go. So thanks again for having me here today.
Mr. Welsh, I was going to hold off in here, but I just one question is, in historical perspective, as somebody who in a term-limited world has not been here very long. So if you look at it from a historical perspective, and you have that, I do not, are you suggesting that this is not abnormal, the sort of criticism and oversight we've had in the last year?
I have never seen anything like it. I mean, essentially, basically, the way appeals issues have been resolved is through appeal and litigation. And the concept of having stakeholder meetings to directly deal with issues that come before the board is brand new.
So are you suggesting it's better, or
Absolutely. See, the reason I think it's better, apart from the fact that you get this kind of give and take discussion without the rules of evidence, without all the formalities of having a hearing, is that the process of adjudication itself, which of course is necessary for due process, sometimes is not all that efficient. If a judge, for example, in Superior Court gets the law wrong, you have to wait for that matter to be appealed by a party, number one. It may or may not be appealed, but let's say it does get appealed. Goes to a court of appeal. Court of appeal says, writes an opinion, instructs the Superior Court judge that he or she got it all wrong. Goes back, often on remand, to be fixed. That process can take years, and it's in the context of one case or controversy. A board has management capability over its administrative law judges, so it can actually exercise management over those ALJs in a way that, say, an appellate court can't over a Superior Court judge. It does have this public meeting requirement. They meet, I think, twice a month.
Every other week.
Every other
every
week.
2 weeks.
And there's always a portion of the meeting.
Normally that would be twice a month.
I had to figure that out.
I don't need a lot of historical, right.
But anyway,
really getting down to the details now.
I mean, so, regularly there's an opportunity for public discussion, and that hasn't been taken advantage of. It's always been the case since the board existed that they have public meetings and they're open for public discussion. But it's only in the past year, in addition to the stakeholder meetings, that we've had people starting to attend those board meetings and actually engage the board directly in discussion. So, yes, I think it's historic.
So I guess just to play devil's advocate here, not necessarily disagree, we've got dozens of boards in the state that function just as this board is supposed to, which I agree with, is if we can save money by this kind of quasi-adjudical process, if I'm saying that right, that we save money in going through the courts, and that some of the inefficiencies, it's nice to hear an attorney say that as a non-attorney, but we don't have this kind of controversy around any of those other boards that I'm aware of. So what makes this particular appeals board unique is that we're changing, is what you're suggesting, for the better, that we're allowing for more broad discretion and give and take is what I'm hearing from you. However, I'm not aware of any other board that's getting this kind of scrutiny, both from the federal government and from outside the building, this building, and inside the building. So it seems counterintuitive to me. Or maybe you're just pioneers.
Could I mention one reason?
Sure.
We eliminated backlog. Look at most of your agencies and the ones you're talking about. They kept their heads under the radar. When you're not a target, you subject yourself. What I've found, and I've only been in state government a limited time, is that when you go out and you do something, I mean, you're safer if you don't do anything. If you don't do anything, it's hard to get a lot of criticism. But when you go out and you actually accomplish something, and in this case, what we did was we had like a funnel, 2,500 cases backed up that we had to push through 4 years. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're subject to controversy. There's no doubt in my mind, but that's, you all may see it differently, but that's the reason.
I think I've acknowledged that, and that's really good news. Just trying to get onto the, and I'm not, I'm challenging in so much as that I want to try to figure in my own mind, if we're making progress, what are the limitations of that progress? And believe me, I know that I frequently mention a quote by Woodrow Wilson recently vis-a-vis my efforts to do reform in this building. Wilson said the quickest way to get enemies in politics is to suggest change. So maybe that's part of your problem, and
it's a good problem to have.
It can be, but maybe that's not the issue. So I think our responsibility is to see if that is it. And in that case, we would support you, is my inclination. Anyways, with that, I will, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you for indulging myself.
Honorable chairs and members, thanks for the opportunity to update you on the progress that we've been making and our ongoing efforts to improve the appeals process, which is a lot easier to do, by the way, when you don't have a backlog. As you know, in 2008, the board announced that the backlog would be behind it beginning in 2009, and we announced at that time, in about mid-2008, that we would begin the year of customer service in 2009, and we'd be able to recreate and improve the system. And so we did some things. We took on several different initiatives. The first one is, Lynn had mentioned, we constituted the first ever advisory committee to seek input from stakeholders on how to improve the appeals process. It had never been done before. In a previous hearing, a former chief counsel of ours testified that he had advised against that and would continue to advise it against that. As a quasi-judicial body, everybody at the body said don't do it. However, we've done it because, at least in my vision, it's the right thing to do. And we stand the best chance of really improving the system through that kind of input. So that's why we've taken on that. We had 3 meetings in 2009. We have 10 scheduled for this year. And as a result of that input, we've revised our scheduling of hearings. And this year we're embarking on regulatory revisions that hopefully take us a little bit further along in the process. We also, in 2009, held a pilot project, and that project sought to remedy one of the complaints that everyone had across the board, which is when an appeal is filed, the abatement requirements are stayed. So what we did is we started a pilot project that would expedite hearings where abatement was at issue. And we conducted that for a 6-month period. We had very good results. We're really pleased with that project, as were, I think, everybody that was in the project. And this year, we're revising our regulations, and one of the regulations that the group has agreed on is a regulation that will make this pilot project permanent, so that the fact of abatement or abatement not occurring because of the stay will no longer be an issue. So we're excited about that. We've had great results. That was another customer service initiative. Another one that we took on was training. One of the things we saw we believed to be a degradation in the presentation of cases before the board. And so we thought one of the best ways we can help people to understand what we're seeing and is to give our perspectives. So we took our presiding judges and we had them do training workshops on how to present your case for the board. It's never been done before. None of these things have been done before. And again, this is a year of customer service. It's the kind of things you expect to see. And as a result of that, we've had very, very many positive, very well attended. We probably had 500 people attend across the state in 3 different workshops. We're also going to have those this year. We're going to do them a little bit differently. We're going to have 2 days of a workshop instead of 1, with the first day being kind of beginning class and the next day being a more advanced class for the attorneys that present before us. All of these initiatives were envisioned in 2008 and on the board's accord because it was the right thing to do. Some of them were brought to our attention because of the bill that did fail. There were things in there that were clearly good concepts, and so we wanted to take some of those and move them forward because it was the right thing to do. But the one thing that I think people sometimes forget amidst I guess a world storm that we've created, like the white tornado, right, where we come in and we're going to eliminate the backlog and we're making all these changes and we're keep people off the footing because we keep changing the process up. There's some really good things that are happening, and so I wanted to take just a moment to do that because I believe that when you look at these things, you see that the program really is working and it's working well. And when I say the program, I'm talking about the Cal OSHA program, which is the 3 branches of the program. The Standards Board set the regulations, the Enforcement Branch, OSHA, and then the Appeals Branch. So at any rate, the first one, and you all have these slides as well, up here you see the injury and illness rates. 1998 through 2008. In 1998, that injury and illness rate was 6.7. Now that's 4.4. And if you look at that chart, what you see is it's trending downwards, which is where we want to see it go. So that's a good thing. The source of this is the Division of Occupational Safety and Health, which is your statistics. The next one that I think is very interesting as well is that you notice the state plan states, which California is one of, and the average state plan states, all the other state plan states, their average penalty is $305. California's is $1,221. It's quite a difference. So I think we're doing something right there in terms of deterrent. Maybe that's why the injury and illness rates keep getting better, is because of the deterrent effect that those penalties have. Another thing, and I think Chairman Desaulnier, you mentioned in yours something about the appeals and employers appealing, and there's been some huge misinformation around how many appeals are occurring. We are experiencing the lowest number of appeals ever. You have to go back to, I guess it's 1999, to find a year that's similar. And if you remember 1999, something happened that year. It was AB 1127, where the penalties increased drastically. That was the year that everything, the number of appeals went up in 2000, and they continue to go up. Well, I think that's another indication we're doing something right, is fewer people are appealing. And so that number's gone down from about 5,000 appeals to about 3,000 now. So I think you can say we're absolutely doing something right. And here's another slide that has a different perspective, which is the violations cited versus those contested. Sometimes we forget, I think, the entire universe of what OSHA is doing, or DOSH is doing. If you look at this has 1998 to 2004, the entire universe of violations contested in those years. And what you notice is that 138,000 of the roughly 181,000 are not contested at all, which means that employers accept those, basically admitting that DOSH is spot on. So I think absolutely DOSH is doing something right. Most of their violations are not even contested. Of those that are contested, and you notice that percent is about 31% that's contested throughout those years. If you go to the next slide, I think you'll see something that it's really interesting. Now, here I actually, I guess, took a little bit from the Senate Office of Research Analysis and the employer non-reporting penalty reductions at OSHAB. They had a number in there, and I don't have any other numbers, so I'm going to use his number, and obviously they're pretty good over there. They use an 85% of the violations are affirmed in the cases of the 342A. I just use that to show you really what we're really looking at in the universe of violations. What we're really looking at is that 4% of alleged violations are not affirmed or admitted by employers. That's a very small percent. So you see in this 181,000, 6,371 are the ones that we're really talking about that, I guess DOSH hasn't been, if you want to call it, spot on. We're doing something right. I hope this helps put in perspective a little bit of what's happening on appeal. The next thing I wanted to point out to you is that midway through 2009, and this again, the year of customer service, based upon stakeholder input, we decided that and the fact there was no backlog, we could reduce the number of hearings and change the way we were scheduling hearings, and so we did. And what we found on this slide, and I don't have a large slide for that, but you all have it in front of you, it's OSHAB hearings scheduled and held in 2009. It's a pretty blue-green. Here's what we found is, and this is something we'll be continuing to look at the trends, but January through June, we were scheduling, you see about 1,000 hearings. At that time, 6% of the hearings were actually held, so held versus scheduled, and the settlement rate was 79%. Overall, now that settlement rate, I'm taking a little bit out of context just to give you an idea that was the settlement rate at that time. In July through December, we said we'd reduce to 2 hearings, and we did. And what we found was, obviously there's not as many hearings scheduled, a little over 700, but 10% went to hearing. And the settlement rate went down 2%, 77%. So there's something to be said for finding the right number of hearings to be set or scheduled. And if that means that more go to hearing, or maybe the settlement rate goes down a little bit, that may be a good thing. And so we may be looking at this, and from my perspective, is to figure out what the right number of hearings is, where people take everything they want to take to hearing and maybe even a little bit more, and we can tie that to a number of ALJs, and it can be tied to a number of attorneys for OSHA and such, so that we can say, we want them to take everything they can to hearing every time they have a good case. It's a lot easier to take fresh, good cases to hearing than it is the old cases, which many times you end up settling, and because they are so old and there aren't any witnesses any longer, or the witnesses don't work there any longer, or the business isn't in business any longer, or even the witnesses that are there don't remember what happened 2 and 5 and 6 years ago. So we're proud to be a part of continuing to look at these, the data, figure out where we can do things better, get the input from the folks that are out there that know, and continue to make a better process. So I hope the one thing I guess I want to finish with, because I've heard this several times, we're not biased. You know, I realize that I have a certain life experience and I see through a certain lens. I can't help that, but I can tell you I do everything within my power to be absolutely objective and neutral. And I know that as we continue this process, this is why I embrace this process, because when there's an information void, it's filled with misinformation and disinformation. We haven't spoken for a long time because the institution didn't think it was appropriate for us to be speaking. You know, you don't see the courts talking about the OJ case afterwards and telling you why they did what they did. So we had a lot of institutional pushback on this idea of having stakeholder meetings or talking about what we do. I believe you can no longer do that really in any institution. You know, the day and age is gone. There's too many forms of media and too many people out there, whether it's a LA Times reporter or whatever, folks can get their issues aired there, and oftentimes with a slant and a bias. I can only tell you that we will continue to show you and do anything we can to prove to you that we are not biased, because I know that the facts will bear it out in the end, but I know it's a process, and so I just look forward to continuing to have this opportunity. Thank you.
So I've got wonderful questions here, very technical, but I'm a generalist. So both of you basically are of the view that the criticisms that are coming are not because of inefficiencies, but actually the boldness that you're going through and sort of changing the process. Am I hearing it right? And that when the federal government finishes their audit, we should expect laudatory comments.
No, I don't think that they're baseless criticisms. I think that many of them are legitimate. Some are overblown. I think that's why we're in the stakeholder process, to sort the criticism out and to discuss where they're legitimate, how to fix the problem.
Okay, can you be more specific? What are the legitimate concerns?
Well, virtually all the procedural ones that have been raised, and I think there's been a fair amount of acknowledgement of that from the board. Some of them, of course, are, you could look at it as a blame thing, or you could look at it as an opportunity thing. I mean, they did have a backlog they had to get rid of. That was priority number one. And if they were going to get rid of that backlog, that did require some other things to take a back seat. Now that the backlog is gone, people can talk about procedural things like overbooking hearings, continuances, location of hearings. And I
what
think
is a serious violation?
The substantive stuff as well. One issue that I think needs further exploration, besides the serious issue, is the sort of the focus on the result. If we, and I've had numerous discussions with stakeholders on this, and I have to say there's not perfect consensus among the stakeholders, but they understand it's a fair issue and we need to work it out. And we haven't really had much of a discussion in the stakeholder meetings with the board on this issue. But basically, when we go in and we do an inspection, we see a bona fide serious hazard. There could be 3 or 4 regulations that potentially apply to that hazard. And if there is an adjudicatory process that focuses on the hazard and the end result, which should be, if it's a real hazard, it needs to get fixed, number one, and number 2, there has to be responsibility assigned for the fact that that hazard existed. That's what the appeals process exists for, the citation process. If there's a hazard and it wasn't fixed, and it's something that should have been fixed, then somebody's liable for that hazard. And in many cases, and this spans the history of the program, this is not something that is unique now, but in many cases in the past, there's been this game being played, and maybe game is the wrong word, but what happens is, at hearing, there's a conclusion that we cited the wrong standard. If we only cited standard X instead of standard Y, then everything would have been great. But we picked the wrong standard, so out the window goes the whole case. And I just don't think that's right. I think there needs to be more of a focus on what do we exist here, what are we here for? We're here to address hazards. And when a hazard is fairly identified, then there needs to be a process that's flexible enough. If it's so important to get exactly the right standard right that's being cited, there's a process that's flexible enough to allow for amendment or allow for justice to be done in the end instead of dismissing the entire case without anybody being held accountable for the hazard. Now, one approach would be for Cal OSHA to, well, let me tell you what tends to happen now. Our inspectors tend to cite every single standard they can think of that might apply. So they might cite four different regs, and if it's a serious hazard, then that's 4 different serious citations because they want to be sure that they're going to win on appeal. The process goes to appeal, and generally speaking, the board has a long-standing precedent that it only takes one violation to address a hazard. So they're not going to necessarily uphold all 4 citations. Even if you could argue that every single one of the regs apply, they're going to tend to pick one, which is fine. But the trouble is that if we go to settle the case and all we ever wanted in the first place was the employer to take responsibility for that one hazard, then our inspector is going to say, fine, we'll get rid of the other 3 serious as long as you accept responsibility for that one. So right there, 75% of our penalties are getting reduced on settlement. We look bad, the board looks bad, everybody looks bad. So if we had a process where we sort of pick the one best regulation that applies, and we go for that, and if it turns out at hearing that we got it wrong, if there's a liberal enough policy of amendment at hearing to conform to proof, which most courts recognize, all courts I think in California recognize, then we can sort of stand down from that oversighting kind of mode that we tend to find ourselves in from time to time. Now, I do want to say that I've seen some evidence in this board, particularly in the last year, that there is some of the ALJs anyway are looking favorably upon last-minute amendments or amendments at hearing. I've seen a couple instances where they've allowed those kinds of amendments. So I think that there is some acknowledgement that a process like that has to occur. We, the stakeholders, or I should say the stakeholders in discussions I've been in, have not been in enough agreement to submit a rulemaking proposal to the board on that issue. I think they will be in not too much more time, and that, I think, is when we begin a process of dialogue with the board to talk about whether they can adopt a reg that would sort of set out the parameters of that process.
So, and Mr. Welsh, forgive me again.
Sure.
At one point in my life, I wanted to go to law school, and it was a long time ago. So I guess the parameter is the flexibility in amending it. And you would argue that you need a liberal ability to do that, I think was your term.
Yeah, actually kind of in line with what the courts typically do is all I'd say we really need.
So back to historical perspective, did previous boards take
In my opinion, yes. In my opinion, the policy of the board has always been too restrictive.
Restrictive. And did that hurt the employer community, do you think, or?
I think it hurt everybody. I think it hurts. I think employers want to see justice done. They want to see their competitor who's not following the rules get held accountable. So if something goes on appeal and a citation gets thrown out on a technicality, as the phrase goes, then justice is not done, and it helps employers no more than it helps employees.
And I would think they want a certain level of predictability as well. Or
they
then
do.
They don't bother to contest.
They want predictability. They want assurances that Cal OSHA is not going to overreach in its citing process, and that's a legitimate concern. They want a fair process, basically. And reasonable minds can differ on what a fair process looks like. But in my opinion, there's always been a little bit too much rigidity in the amendment process before the board.
Mr. Trey, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would suggest that sometimes where we have this a little bit of tension between parties before us, it is based on the labor code. there's a labor code section that the board believes it's bound by that says that the division must cite with specificity. And what it deals with is that the thought that people should know what it is they're being charged with so they can prepare a defense. That's the notion behind it. If the legislature were to decide to do so, it might want to look at that. I don't have the labor code on the top of my head, but I can definitely give that to you. And if you all like to change it, we love guidance. I can tell you at the board, the last thing we want to do is be stuck in a position where we have to try to say what you all were thinking. But if you'd like, we can certainly identify these areas, and then if you all want to, change that, we would love it. It would help us, really. Nobody wants to be the guys out there that are doing this rigid interpretation, but yet the judges, I have 8, 10, however many judges looking at it, and then 2 or 3 board members. We're all looking at it and seeing the same thing and interpreting it the same way. It's just that it's not in agreement with the enforcement body, and that's fine. I mean, the bottom line is you guys are the ultimate arbiter, so that we'd love to have your help on that. Can I go into a couple other things, though? The abatement project should fix a lot of the concerns that if several things are cited and something won't be fixed, because the expedited abatement project will actually take those things and make those abated immediately. Mm-hmm. So that should help that. And then the standard on amendment really hasn't changed. It just requires good cause. And so you have, if you're going to make a late amendment or a last-minute amendment, an amendment at the hearing, it's just a good cause standard. In other words, why couldn't you have done this before? Is there some good cause reason? And courts all across the nation, even quasi-judicial bodies, use good cause because they need to be able to deal with any given situation that really does constitute something that is good cause.
I appreciate that. So you mentioned customer service. Who is the customer?
Everybody. If you phone, fax, email, walk in, anybody that would ever be in touch with the board is a customer. And the way I look at it is internal and external. My internal customers are the people that work at the board, and I try very hard to have a set of performance measures within my group, the internal customers, and then the external customers, which is everybody else who ever touches the board. And I think it's really, I hope really that over time, as taxpayers we're asked to, pay more. I think eventually we're going to be paying more for our government. That there's some accountability that comes with that, and this oversight process is accountability, and that's one of the reasons I like it. Although we hold ourselves accountable, it's a much different thing to be held accountable from the outside. So our customers, our external customers in particular, we're accountable to them and how we treat them and how that acts and the process they get and the fact at the end of the day, we want to be the premier state agency that people call or whatever it is they do, and they say, wow, that was incredible. I've never had such a great experience at the state. My people walk around the office saying, we're not like state workers, like we're great, and we do all these things. And along the way, they've embraced. I know
I'm not sure that was the right thing to say to the Labor Committee, but go ahead.
Okay, I'll stop. I know I get excited. I'm passionate about my beliefs, and I think it's one of the reasons we've been able to accomplish what we have. And my people have not, complained or joined in some of the efforts that have been out there. But I did want to mention the criticism part, because you start out the question saying were the criticisms legitimate. They were legitimate for a time when we were clearing the backlog, yes. I mean, did we have to schedule more? Yep. Did we do it in a way that we achieved the results that we expected? Yep. We did it in a very deliberate manner. I planned 2 years. It took us 4. 4 years, folks. 4 years is not a fast time to clear up a backlog. If you were in the private sector and you said, give me 4 years, boss, and I'll do it, you wouldn't have a job a year from now. But it took us 4 years. It was deliberate. It was methodical. Our judges looked at every single case and determined what could be set with what, because they could tell old cases were going to be settled. And that didn't come from me. I have no basis of knowledge. But when a judge looks at a case that's been around for 15 years, the case has only been around 5 or 6 years, they can tell what's going to settle and what isn't. They can tell because the amount is low. It's usually less than $1,000. They can tell because it's just one issue, usually a regulatory or a general issue. And they'll look at those and they'll say, this should have been settled a long time ago. And guess what? If we set this for hearing, it is going to settle. And they were very right about those results. So are those criticisms legitimate? Yes, for a period of time you're clearing the backlog. Are they legitimate starting in 2009, especially when we reduced the number of hearings? No, they're not. So that's...
Okay, and I guess the concern is that, in full acknowledgement that you've done a great job on the backlog, and you've certainly attempted on the accessibility issues, and that's, I think we're all proud and acknowledge that you've been able to do that individually, but also as a department. But has any of that come at the expense of any constituent or customer group? And that's the concern, I think, and so I want to just go through briefly, because just on the numbers of the Senate Office of Research, since we had a problem with that, and you referenced one of them in your conversation, so I'd just like to be sure that if there's a disagreement, maybe I have an understanding of it, and since it comes from the Senate Office of Research, then I'll turn it over to Mr. Monning and let him ask some questions. But on the settlement rates, the SOR says the settlement rates have increased by roughly 13.5% under the current board. The average settlements per month are about 61%. And some of what I heard you say, that both of you say, that maybe that's because of this new process of engaging all of the parties.
I could speak to the settlement rate in the SOR. You know, one nice thing, the good news and the bad news. The good news is the SOR processor, seeing these papers that we were given on Thursday, gave us an opportunity to see what the assumptions or what the basis of knowledge was for making the assertions. And it also made us question, because when we saw those numbers, we thought, wait a second, something's not right here. So we went to work on what it was, and what we found, something that we had, during our years of backlog, we often refined our processes. One of the processes we refined, that until we sat down yesterday and really said why, the papers point to this, people are 2/3 less likely to withdraw, and the board doesn't dismiss as many cases. And are like, there's no way. I mean, we know we do. We're cooking. We're doing a lot. And so what we realized was that, wait, don't you remember when we changed the process? What we did, because there were so many withdrawals or even dismissals that were ambiguous. In other words, somebody would write in a letter and say, I want to withdraw my citation because I talked to the division. We've got a deal. Or they've agreed to amend my citation if I do this. What we started doing, instead of writing a letter to them, because we used to just write a letter saying, we dismiss your case, or you withdraw your case, okay, here's your letter. We counted those letters and we put them on a column we called dismissals. Okay? Or if an employer said, I'm going to withdraw because of this, we put it on withdrawals. But we decided that we had a big problem with that, because as we were processing cases more quickly, back in the backlog days it didn't matter because people had plenty of time to make amendments. But when we started closing that gap down on the front end, they didn't have the time to make the amendments or to have those talks. And so what was happening is people were having a talk but not getting an amended citation because we were moving too quickly. We started assigning them to our judges. And we told the judges, from now on, you're going to handle these. The judges would handle those, and what they would do is issue an order. And the order then would say whatever it was the people were trying to say, including the amendment that Dosh might have made. You know, we reduce this if you do that, and so on. So the number of orders went up dramatically. And like I said, until yesterday, I can't tell you the amount. We'll be looking into what that number is. But that affected what looks to be a settlement rate, because those are orders. And the settlements are orders plus stipulations. People stopped doing stipulations. They became orders, went into the settlement rate. people stop, and it's just like, oh, why didn't we think of that? That was one of the things. I bet you it accounts for, if I was going to say, maybe it accounts for like 5%. I don't know. It's not, it might be 5 to 7%. And by the way, we calculate the other thing that, an assumption that was made, if you go back to the old days, the board calculated everything on appeals, not cases. In 2002, we started counting both. How many appeals in a case? If you look back at the old data that only says appeals, you get a different number because X number of appeals, for instance, back in 1998, there were 3.5 appeals in a case. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason we know that's because we took 1 year and we went back and actually counted them. But that's changed. Now, we're at 2.3 right now, appeals per case. Mm-hmm. So because he took the numbers, or the numbers that are a basis of his findings are appeals, raw appeals, and not cases, the numbers are off. My biggest regret with this, and hopefully in the future we can improve that process, is we asked all along that once the data was given over, that perhaps any kind of analysis or assumptions that were made, we could have the opportunity to review those, because we thought we could probably lend something to the process because we're used to looking at our own data. So unfortunately, most of the data is wrong because of false assumptions. I mean, based on the assumptions he used, yep, absolutely right. And in fact, a good job. I used to be an industrial engineer at UPS and look at numbers all the time. And the analysis is solid using those assumptions. It's just the assumptions are wrong. And so hopefully in the future we can sit down. That would be my hope, is that maybe we could sit down and talk about those things and then get the right data, get the right numbers. But anyway, so I'll have the correct settlement data for you. But if your question is the settlement higher, then I say the answer is yes. During a backlog, it's absolutely higher. Right now, what's happened? I showed you on those numbers that the settlement rate is gone from 79% to 77%, and that's down from the backlog years. So I don't know.
So your number you still believe is 4%, the number that you have cited in the past, that the settlement rate's gone up by 4%, as opposed to the Senate Office of Research.
No, I was asked a question, I think it was at my first confirmation, maybe it was my second confirmation hearing. The question was this: what was the settlement rate during the last 10 years? This was in 2008. I was asked now because I remember, because it was 1998. What was the settlement rate over the last 10 years? And how does the settlement rate during the last 5 years, or since you've been here, differ? The answer is the same today as it was then, 4%, 81 and 84, 85. I mean, I could show you, I actually have that chart for you, but that's a question I was asked. Now, can you look at that information differently? Yep. You can just separate out the years. You can say, what was it from 1998 to 2004? What is it from 2005? And it's two different ways, and it's two different questions. So do I agree with the Senate Office of Research settlement numbers? No, it's off a little bit. But I see a 9% difference. Right. And I think probably a 5 to 7% of that is probably because of the dismissals and the withdrawals that we moved over to that category as orders. But I think the settlement rate is up a little bit.
Okay, but you think that you could reconcile some of these if there was further discussion between sort of what the question was and... Okay.
I'd like to, because it'd be good information.
On their numbers on decisions after reconsideration, how do you feel about those? And I've got it's twice as much as the board has pulled up in the previous 9 years.
Is this the own motion piece?
Okay. This board has pulled an average of almost 22% per year on its own motion. Okay,
so if you look at your charts I put in there, the first one says OSHAB reconsiderations on its own motion. It shows that 58% of the board's own motion cases that are cited, 2005 through 2009, are 342A cases. 342A is an area that the board's been struggling with. And again, we're definitely open to a legislative fix on this. This is the language that's permissive on the one hand. It says they may, and then it sounds like maybe it's not because it says every case. Anyway. So we've been struggling with that, and we've also been struggling with trying to get our ALJs to do what we think's right in terms of the penalty reduction. And so we've produced one DAR that gives them some guidance on that, and hopefully will make a difference in the penalty side. But at any rate, back to the board's own motion. And then the next, if you turn the next page, has another thing on own motion. And what it does, it also adds a few more in there because there's some groups that the board was dealing with. What frequently happens that skews these numbers is that there are all of a sudden this issue that comes up. For instance, in 342A, it was the main thing that OSHA was citing. And there were so many of these cases in the backlog because nobody wanted to deal with them, that when we pushed them all through, we ended up with a lot of those. And the board was trying to figure out, what do we do with these? And so we pulled them for reconsideration. Now, I would posit to you is that either way we would have been in trouble. Let's just say we let them all go. We'd be sitting here talking about, why did the board let all these terrible things go? But we pulled them. Why did you pull them? You can't. In many of these cases, we're faced with a no-win situation. If we pull cases because we don't like what our judges do, we're asked why we're pulling so many. But if we don't pull them, we're asked why we let them go. So I don't know how you really win this argument other than to say that there are groups of cases, and in this case what you see when you add financial hardship, and then name cases, this was an issue people wanted us to deal with, technicality of not naming the proper entity, those are cases too. So what you come up with is about, I think it's 64% or something, I guess I forgot to write the percent on here, that are really boiled down to 42 issues, if you will. So it's like we pulled 42 instead of 109. Is that a lot? Yeah. Let me add the other factor on. And when you look at this chart, it becomes a little bit evident what happens with us excited new board members. In 2005, there was a new board member. That was me. You look at that and you see what happened. We pulled more that year, and it looks like we pulled about 15. Okay. Now look at the next time we got a new board member, Bob Pacheco in 2007. It spiked up again. In 2009, look what happened. New board member, really spiked up. Now, by the way, I wasn't even at one meeting when they pulled 42. We were all 342A. But what tends to happen with new board members is you see the stuff that the ALJs are producing. I love my ALJs, but you look at it and you want to pull every case. You're kind of like, they did this wrong, they did that wrong. And there's always something you can find in there. But until that levels off, until you really get that, oh, okay, we can't fix every case. We've got to be somewhat discriminating about what we're going to fix and what we're going to take on as a challenge. So that's the reason I think you have 3 new board members throughout this 5-year period. You have a group of cases that warranted it. And so that's on pulling at its own motion. And like I said, if we hadn't pulled them, we'd be talking about why we didn't pull them.
Okay. I guess I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So I'm a big person on outcomes and benchmarks, and you've mentioned that you are as well. But if you don't get the numbers right, then you can't get to the second part of the question about why do the numbers mean what they mean, or why are they doing this? So in these 2 instances, on the settlements, you basically have a disagreement with the SOR numbers. You say it's 4%. There's a 9% difference.
I think
and you attribute that to certain things.
I think it's a 9% difference. There's 2 different questions I said. The one question is, what's the settlement rate the last 10 years? That's a number. 84%, let's say, 98 through 2008. Then what has it been the last 5 years, which is another number. And that was, like I said, that was whatever it was, 84. There was a 4% difference. The numbers that you have now before you show a 9% difference when we look at the whole period of time.
Right.
Okay. We break out, 98 through 2004, 2005 through 2009. And I believe that number to be 9% difference.
So basically it was a different question than what you were given at Rules when you were confirmed.
That is correct. Okay.
And then on the second number, I understand the whole issue of your response as to you be criticized one way or the other. Mm-hmm. But are the numbers accurate that SOR's got?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Maybe back for more, but we've spent a lot of time. So Mr. Monning has been chomping at the bit.
Sorry.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank both of you for your presentations, for the work that you've done in moving moving the objective forward of worker health and safety. I mean, that's the overarching goal. And the reference earlier to impacts of underground economy, I'm curious where you have unregistered employers, people paying under the table, who are perhaps maintaining the least safe work spots. I'm just prefacing with my interest in that area and how OSHA is coordinating with other enforcement agencies, whether it's workers' comp, EDD, et cetera, because I think this is one area where the state is not only losing valuable revenues just in payroll tax, but where there's probably the greatest risk for worker injury, worker health and safety, where employers are willing to fly under the radar, not follow any other rules. They're certainly not going to be maintaining the safest workplaces. But I'll circle back to that. I wanted to start with Mr. Welch and just a question. I understand the distinction between investigation, enforcement, and then the hearing process once there have been citations, and then the appellate process. And this is how constituted administrative boards work. There is necessarily an interplay between board members and standards and procedures and processes. But Mr. Welch, I want to focus on your comment that California is currently not granted permanent recognition by the federal government for our OSHA standards, and that one area where there's a deviation between federal standard and state standard is on the definition of serious violation. You suggested that you, in your capacity as director, can issue a director's regulation, and that you are contemplating this in the area of serious violation. What is the difference between the federal and the state definition, and why not adopt the federal definition of serious violation?
First of all, the formula for both agencies in broad terms is that there must be a substantial probability that serious physical harm could result from the violation. It's much longer than that, but that's the core concept. And the Labor Code goes on to say that it's not the probability that a injury will occur as a result of the violation, but if an accident occurs as a result of the violation, what's the probability that the resulting injury will be serious? Where we begin to part company is how the agencies define the phrase substantial probability. That's one, and the other is serious physical harm. And actually, I have to say that it is unclear to me exactly what the California approach is to this to some extent, and I'll get into that in a second. Basically, in the Federal Field Operations Manual, which is an instruction to federal enforcement staff, they include criteria for serious physical harm that are very similar to what we have in our Labor Code as a definition of serious, quote, serious injury, serious permanent disfigurement, loss of a body member, stay in the hospital for more than 24 hours for purposes other than observation. That's serious injury. The feds have a fourth category they call, in general terms, loss of efficiency of a part of the body for more than 24 hours. It's kind of an odd phrase, but it's a very important one. And they list out lots of examples in addition to those four concepts of what would be considered serious physical harm. In California, in DOSH policy and procedure, we have specific instructions for certain regs as to what to classify as serious, but they don't go into it as much in a conceptual sense as they do, like, for example, bloodborne pathogens. If there's a failure to guard say, a needle with a protective device, that would be considered serious. We sort of do it on an example basis. Now, the board actually has a case from way back in the 80s, a Body Farms Produce, which did articulate a fourth type of serious physical harm in addition to the Labor Code serious injury. And they used that language, loss of efficiency of part of the body. They fleshed it out, said a loss of efficiency, significant loss of efficiency of part of the body for more than 24 hours on or off the job. The board has actually cited that case in subsequent DARs favorably, but it's never applied that case since, as far as I know. And so I think one rejoinder to that might be, well, if DOSH argues that the Abadi Farms rule ought to be applied, then perhaps the board would apply it.
It's possible.
And so, and I think actually that we will be doing that. We've actually got an instruction like that in some of our policies and procedures. But fact of the matter is we don't often get to litigating these things, and it can take years and years and years to have one of these cases actually come up for adjudication. So that, again, brings you back to rulemaking. Could some sort of rulemaking process speed up clarification of what the formula is in California so that federal OSHA is satisfied that we're on the right track? And that's where I come. I've suggested before that perhaps the board could adopt a regulation, and I'm getting some pushback from some of the legal authorities, not just the board, by the way, that the board may not have statutory authority to engage in rulemaking beyond rules of practice and procedure, which essentially are procedural. Whether the board can engage in rulemaking on substantive issues is not really addressed in the labor code as far as I can see, but there are some government code provisions elsewhere that might suggest in general that administrative law adjudicatory bodies maybe can't go there. So I return to the concept of a director's reg, and I did want to clarify one thing. My title is actually Chief of the Division of Cal OSHA. The director of the Department of Industrial Relations is John Duncan. And actually, there are regulations which the department adopts as director's regs, which essentially Cal OSHA would shepherd through the rulemaking process. That's what we did with the multi-employer policy in the 90s. So my suggestion was that the department actually, with Cal OSHA's help, engage in rulemaking to put into place a formula like this. And I think historically the board's position has been that they're not bound by director's regs, although they do give them some weight in applying them. And this is, I've also said publicly, I think we need to do a director's reg on multi-employer liability to set some of the issues straight so we get out of the courts with this endless litigation on it. And again, my sense is that if stakeholders really get behind a rulemaking process and a reg is adopted on a consensus basis, that can have a substantial influence on how the board views the reg itself and its own case law.
So what is the interplay? Are you in a position to suggest a director's regulation?
Yes.
And are you in the process of doing that with respect to the definition of a serious injury, the classification as you've been describing?
We're not in the process of doing that. We have been discussing with stakeholders this concept. We've had several discussions with stakeholders, and I think we need at least one more before we go out on rulemaking. This is the way we normally go about regs that are that have a significant impact on the program. We try to get as much input from stakeholders in advance before we get into the 45-day comment period. You know, the comment period itself provides an opportunity for everybody to weigh in, but it doesn't really provide an opportunity for discussion, which I think is vital to getting a reg people are going to embrace. So I'd say we're on the verge of doing it.
Okay, and one of my concerns related to the promulgation of regulations or refinement and definition goes to how the board accepts the evaluation and expertise of investigators who are issuing citations and then being determined not to have the expertise to issue that citation. And I want to hear from both of you, but first with Chief Welch. Aren't your inspectors trained to, in issuing a citation, they've undergone training to identify conditions that pose a health and safety risk? If there's an injury, if somebody's hospitalized for over 24 hours, they're basing their citations based on their job description, which involves a certain level of expertise. And then, as I understand it, some of these cases are getting to the appellate level where their expertise is questioned and it undercuts the viability of that complaint. So I'm interested in your reaction to that characterization, and then I'd like to hear from the board chair on that issue as well. If we can't rely on the expertise of inspectors to know when there's a serious condition or there's been a serious injury, you can't recreate the situation and bring in some outside consultant with academic credentials. How are you grappling with that?
Well, first of all, I think this is a serious and important issue, and I think it will come up in our stakeholder meetings, and I hope it will be the subject of a proposed regulation for consideration by the board to adopt on how it deals with expert testimony. That might be seen as substantive, it might be seen as procedural. We'll have to talk that one through. But let me start big picture. It does not, in my opinion, make sense to go to the trouble to hire the well-paid and expert staff we have and not allow them in almost all cases to be the experts, to at least offer expert opinion, which will be considered on issues like should the violation be classified as serious, for example, which is where this issue often comes up. So I think if we have a program where that's not happening for whatever reason, there's something wrong with the program. Now, that being said, there's plenty I can do on my side to improve that situation, and I freely concede that. We have not had, in my opinion, ever adequate training of our staff, and I'm in the process of trying to fix that now. We've added quite a few management staff to our agency over the last year who have specific tasks, and probably the most important task I've assigned them is getting a training unit up and running, working as closely with federal OSHA as we can to get access to their training programs, which are quite numerous, and some of them are very good. There's a resource issue there. We have some proposals to resource a training unit, in part because we're getting new federal money. Hopefully, we've been offered it, and we're in the process of trying to accept it. So I think part of the answer is training. Candace mentioned earlier that the board has started to put on training for not just for Cal OSHA inspectors, but for members of the general public. But we do have to train our own staff, and I think we have a lot of work to do in that department. But in the end, we come back to questions like, well, can an industrial hygienist testify about issues that one might argue are medical and only doctors can testify on? That's one that comes up from time to time. And my feeling on that one is, and again, I think this is something we haven't really had a full discussion of in our stakeholder process, but industrial hygiene is a field, I happen to have training in it myself, is a field that includes having a sound understanding of medical issues that impact occupational safety and health. And, it's industrial hygienists and safety engineers who draft and shepherd proposed regulations through the rulemaking process, not physicians, not outside consultants or anything of the like. And I think if they can shepherd a rule, a highly technical rule, through the rulemaking process, they can also offer testimony on how to apply that rule and whether a violation of that rule is serious or not. And I think that we all should be working toward a situation where it's just a given that folks who issue the citation get to testify about the technical issues that have to do with that citation. Now, whether they have, whether their testimony is credited or not in the end, whether the ALJ decides that some other testimony perhaps offered by the employer is more credible, that's fine. That's fair game for adjudication. But to exclude testimony or to be overly technical about admitting it, I think, is not the way to go. And there's whole other issue, which I do hope we probably will take this up with the director's reg, but there are certain kinds of violations which we really shouldn't have to burn up taxpayer resources to address. I mean, if somebody, for example, is working 30 feet above the ground without fall protection, and it's admitted or proven that the violation occurred, and the only question is that serious? Should we really be sitting around and arguing over whether that's a serious violation? Would it make sense to catalog, and we've had discussions of this in our stakeholder process, catalog at least parts of regulations which by definition exist to prevent serious hazardous situations, and say...
Well, if I could just comment on that, there's been a lot of talk about the importance of predictability, and I think what you suggest with some classification of certain things are... it's the very fact that somebody's working at 30 feet high without protection it's not in dispute. It's a de facto case of a violation. But the predictability issue, moving into citations and appeals, do you believe that precedent is important in predictability? And if the precedent is to discount penalty assessments through the course of the appellate process, are we incentivizing employers found in violation to automatically appeal the citation with a precedent being set that if you appeal, it'll be discounted eventually to settle the case?
Well, I think if there isn't a supporting rationale for the penalty reduction, I think then we all get in trouble. First one has to have a sense. It makes sense to be adjudicating this particular matter. So if we're spending hours and hours and hours of testimony on the 30-foot fall, for example, whether that's serious or not, something's wrong. I mean, and it may not be the appeals board's fault. I mean, if they've got to apply, their own precedent, and they can't just, unless they engage in rulemaking, which they may not be able to do on this. I don't know. I think the jury's out on that. But if they don't have a process to catalog, say, regulations, say, well, by definition, it's serious, we don't need testimony on that, then they need somebody else to do it, like the director of DIR or like the legislature. So there is that. Do they have the tools to fix that kind of a problem, even if they want to? And I think the solution here is looking at the three parts of the Cal OSHA program and looking at what each can do to fix that problem, and hoping that we're going to get, which I think we're on the way to doing, enough concordance among the three that we're going to work toward a goal like not incentivizing frivolous appeals. They don't want to see them any more than we do. I have total faith in that. But you do kind of have to step back and look at the big picture and say, well, what message is the employer community or the labor community taking from this process?
Right, and I'm the first to acknowledge an employer respondent has a right to appeal, but if the track record is we're eroding precedent in terms of certain penalty levels for certain types of violations, and that's just becoming negotiated down, then I just think we're incentivizing employers. But Mr. Welch, I want to thank you for your candid comments in response to my questions. I do want to allow Ms. Traeger to respond to some of those issues I've raised. Before I allow you to do that, though, just on your slide 2 on the average penalty per violation, California versus
other states.
Yes. Is that proposed fines or assessed fines? Do you know?
I believe it's assessed fines. It's a number cited. It's right off the Fed OSHA website. So it's an average based across all states and states.
And do you know what percentage of fines are collected in California?
No, we don't have fine collection. I think DIR does that.
So, Mr. Welch, you have a comment on that?
I can get you that information. I can tell you it's much better now than it was 2 years ago, for what that's worth.
And in the interest of time, because we have other people waiting patiently, I know, who are on next panels, if it's all right, we will follow up maybe with some questions in the interest of time that I'm not going to be able to pose to you this morning. But
might I have an opportunity to address that, at least the one issue?
Yeah, on the expert issue, and I just had a clarifying question for you related to that. It's been reported that one of your administrative law judges has a 20-case rule that for any inspector, a DOSH inspector, to be considered or qualified to provide testimony, if that inspector hasn't had experience in 20 cases dealing with the same violation, he or she isn't considered qualified to comment on it. Are you aware of that? And are you supportive of that?
It's a lot of crap. If that's true, which I'm not aware that it is, I haven't heard it before. It's a lot of crap, and I will definitely talk to any ELJ who's said such a thing, because it's not true. It's not. There's no basis in any evidentiary code for that.
Well, I'll be glad to provide you with a citation of who we obtain that information from. But if you could address the question, again, in the interest of time, there's a lot of fine points here, precedent, expertise, etc. I'm most concerned about the discounting of assessed penalties and the expectation employers have that if they simply file an appeal and wait it out, whatever was assessed will eventually be discounted.
Okay.
I understand the interest in clearing backlogs. I understand the rationale of adjudicating and understanding mitigating circumstances. I know employer economic status is one of those issues. I get all of that. My concern is that the precedent that's being set is that if you appeal your case and wait, it's going to get discounted down. And so why pony up an assessment even if you know and admit that you're in violation of a standard?
Okay. The first point, discounting penalties, just appeal and you get something. I mentioned appeals are lower than ever. I think one of the number of appeals and the percent of appeals, however you want to look at that, there's fewer appeals now than there's ever been since 1999. So I don't think it's true that employers think just appeal and you'll get something. Otherwise, we'd probably have more appeals, or the number of appeals would be going up. And they did go up for a while. They went up for the first, I think, 4, 5, 6, but they're back on their way down. So I think that speaks to that point. The next one is DOSH testimony is never not allowed. It's somewhat frustrating because I think there's a misunderstanding here. The testimony is allowed. DOSH testimony is always valid testimony, so it's allowed. The question is if there's an objection that opinion testimony, in other words, all of a sudden I'm switching from just somebody telling what I saw and what I know, what I have personal knowledge of, to giving an opinion. And there's an objection made. Our judge won't do that, but if there is an objection made that person's not an expert and they're giving an opinion, then there has to be a qualification of that person as an expert. Only upon objection. Let me tell you how easily it is to qualify an expert, because there seems to be some misunderstanding there. First of all, you could do it by education. I went to this school, I did this and that, this is what I did. Second, it could be by experience. I've done 2 of these things. In both cases, there was a serious injury. Good, Not my experience, because I don't have experience, but I talked to Joe. Joe in my office said he did 5 of these investigations on the same thing, and in 4 of them, there was a serious injury. You're good. Studies. I could not have any experience. I could not know anybody that has any experience, but I can go look at studies, and I can come back and say, I don't have any experience in this. However, I studied 3 studies from the Harvard's whatever school, and they said blue, 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 and therefore that's what I'm basing my opinion on. The issue is the weight of the testimony. It's not can you do the testimony, it's what weight is it given. So an ALJ then is going to take this, and if they qualify as an expert, like if they can show through their education, through their experience, or through studies that they have some experience, that affects the weight.
I understand that,
testimony.
and you've explained the standard for expert qualification quite well. But your comment, just to be clear, you're not in support of a 20-case rule as being the standard.
That's ridiculous. I
believe
can't
your
even
earlier
believe anybody
testimony
said that.
It was a bunch of crap. Is that
yes,
inaccurate?
I did say that.
Thank you.
I did say that, and I want to know who that judge is, because I can't believe that anybody would do that. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There's no number that could show you. I don't know. I just find it very hard to believe.
In your customer service, either of you, how many languages do you provide your stakeholder meetings access in? How many languages?
If they ask, we can have interpreters on anything. The state has a whole.
Who's the they? How?
If anyone were to ask, if they were, there's in our public. We have a notice that's published at the bottom of each of our agendas that if somebody needs or requires any kind of interpretation, that they can call this number ahead of time.
And how many languages is the notice promulgated in?
The notice is in 1 language. Just English.
I'm going to beg your indulgence to maybe send some follow-up questions. Again, I want to defer to my chair and recognize others waiting to testify. But thank you for your indulgence in my questions. I appreciate it.
So I'm not the attorney, but he is. Just a couple more questions. So I mentioned the federal audit and the criticism that you're getting externally. Do you feel comfortable then that at some point the criticism will start to turn around? And vis-a-vis the federal audit, are you confident that they're going to come back and support a lot of your assertions today.
I would have a lot of confidence in that audit if anybody talked to us. But nobody's ever talked to us, so I don't have a lot of confidence in that audit. In the information that was sent to us, it showed timetables and dates by which we'd be spoken to or certain things would be done. Most of them relating to the board were by 1/30/10, by the 30th of January. We have not been talked to. Nobody at the board's been identified to talk to. I'm a little bit concerned about that because I think it's, and what was said to me, by the way, this is an off-the-record thing, but the federal person who spoke to me about it said, we've been there all along. We knew what you were doing. We knew how you were doing it, the simple cases and the complex cases, somewhat like the feds do. And that LA Times article and the media stuff, we don't have a choice anymore. We have to do this. We know that this is being driven by media, but we still have to do it. And so, having said that, do I believe that this study is going to be fair? If they talk to us, at least we have a chance for it to be fair. If they don't talk to us and they just come with some conclusion next week, I think we're in trouble.
Okay. Do you, I understand the spirit of how you attribute some of the complaints, but the physical genesis, does that come from people like how you responded, the four-letter word beginning with C? I mean, has it been employees, do you feel, of the department who have complained to the LA Times or the federal government? Is that the genesis of the complaints, do you believe? I understand why you think, and that's legitimate, that you're trying to make change.
I believe one of the large genesises, and genesises? I'm sure that's not a word. At any rate, is a former board member that I worked with and, sued me for wanting her to come to work. She was actually in the articles, in most of them. And when I talked to reporters, they said, boy, you have a former board member that told me blah, 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 blah. It was in the PBS story. It's been in a lot of the stories. And when I found that out, it made a lot more sense to me. I just think there's been a concerted campaign. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind. And it's a good campaign. I mean, it's been done very well. And they had some good ammunition and fuel in the fire because we were trying to clean up the backlog.
Okay, and I want to give you an opportunity to respond. You made a comment about your employees versus state employees, and I took that. I responded humorously because if I didn't, I would respond angrily.
Okay.
Do you want to help clarify with me? It certainly sounded
What does that mean? That's their terminology, not mine. When I came into this, my employees.
Of the board? Or?
The employees of the board.
Okay.
The employees of the board talking about the employees of the board. And so it's a limited, people or mindset. And when I came in, they said, we're not, this is what they said. We're not like normal state workers. We want to work harder. We want to be more efficient and effective. We like what you're bringing to the board. So it was, that's maybe something I shouldn't have said, but there is a stigma attached, and I think it's a wrong stigma, but I think there's a stigma attached to state workers. I mean, we hear and we read about it all the time. That's a lot of the CRAP, too, because I don't believe it's true. I believe that you can energize people and bring back their creativity and bring back all that. I think it's a chore because a lot of them have been beaten down over time. By the way, not unlike myself, who will probably not be in this job much longer, which make most people happy. But a lot of us come from the private sector and we think, and you smile, you may have the same experience. We actually think we can make a difference. And so we set about to leave our high-paying jobs that we've had a career, 25 years for me at UPS, making 3 times what I make here. But that's okay. It was my time in my life to do this. This is my time to do public service, much as a lot of you. So you come here to make change, and you're going to bring some of these great things you think you've learned on the outside to the inside, and you're going to make a difference. Now, we really did in my organization, and I'm thrilled and very pleased with my group of people. And it shows that it can be done. It's just that it's very, very difficult. And when you do the change, not a lot of people like change, although there is a way to get people to embrace change. And I think, and this is my last gratuitous comment, that state is the last bastion to resist change. I do not think the state can do it forever. And I think this may be the perfect storm right now because people are going to start expecting more for their money. And we will be paying more, and that's good. But we need more accountability, too. So more oversight.
I don't disagree with you on that. Do you think they feel the same way about employees in general, then? You said they believe that way about state workers. Is that the way they feel about employees in general in the private sector as well? They being people.
I think it's something you see in the media. Wait, do I think my people think that?
Yes.
I think they think they're rare and unique amongst state workers because...
No. I'm talking about employees, workers generally. So I took what you said, that your people, felt that they were superior to state workers. So my question is, do they feel that way about employees in general?
I think they would compare themselves more to private sector people, what the general impression of workers in the private sector is. And this is a crash generalization that's probably not fair, but I do believe it exists. And so I think they were comparing themselves and comparing other people to the broad, unfair generalizations that exist.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Let's see. That'll take us to our second panel. We'll try to move this along a little more quickly. And we've got Ledge Counsel here.
Good morning. Will Modelmog with the Office of Legislative Counsel. I'll keep my remarks brief. Be glad to answer any follow-up questions you may have. We were asked to prepare an opinion addressing the minimum penalty of $5,000 that's set forth in Section 6409.1 of the Labor Code, and specifically address whether that minimum penalty amount applies to the Occupational Safety and Health Appeals Board when they assess penalties. As you know, Section 6409.1 requires employees to report certain illnesses and injuries immediately, and states that if an employer violates that requirement, the employer, quote, may be assessed a civil penalty of not less than $5,000. In our view, the use of the word may in that phrase indicates that there's discretion as to whether to impose a penalty. But if a penalty is imposed, that penalty may not be less than $5,000. Nothing in the statutory language suggests that the minimum penalty provision applies only to the division. In our view, it applies to both the division and to the appeals board. Our view is based on the well-established maximum statutory construction that where the language of a statute is clear and unambiguous, the plain meaning of the statute must be followed. We think that's the provision that a court would apply in interpreting this provision. In our view, the language here is clear and unambiguous, that the penalties may not go beneath $5,000 for a violation of this particular provision, and the lack of any exception for the appeals board indicates that it applies to the board as well as to the division. We're aware of the board's decision in the Callaway case, and we think that a court would conclude that that case was incorrectly decided.
Thank you. Any questions from Mr. Barning? We'll leave the attorney to the attorney.
Well, thank you for that unambiguous statement and clarification. And I think in statute and in law, may and shall are pretty clear. But the not less than is explicit, and that's how you've concluded. Help remind me the status of the Callaway case. Is there any further appeal on that, or is it?
Not that I'm aware of. As far as I know, the board has maintained that the Callaway case is the governing principle in which it continues to apply here.
And is a board decision subject to higher court review?
A board decision is subject to higher court review if a party decides to take it to Superior Court, yes.
Right. But a party may take it to Superior
That's
Court.
Right.
They don't have to, and they don't necessarily have the resources to pursue that.
That's correct, yes.
Well, I appreciate the clarification, and I think it's a question that we didn't get to focus on specifically with the first panel with the chair of the board, but maybe again in some of our follow-up questions we can try to get a better understanding of why the board considers that permissive as opposed to statutorily required.
Okay, that's it. That was easy.
Thank you very much.
Sure. And I'm going to turn over the lead position of chair to Mr. Monning now for the next two panels. So it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and I appreciate the partnership here between our houses, and I know that we share the same common concern for worker health and safety and fair standards, predictable standards, predictability for employees and employers. And joining us now from the employer community, I would ask each of you to please introduce yourself for the record and your affiliation. And we welcome your presence. Look forward to your commentary, your testimony this morning. And Ms. Fisher, will you be leading off?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
Mr. Monning. Well, thank you for giving us the opportunity to participate today and to give you some added perspective on the employer side. I'm Marty Fisher, and I'm a policy advocate with the California Chamber of Commerce. We represent about 15,000 businesses across the state. We are the largest broad-based business association in California. I've been advocating on behalf of employers and working with CalOSHA for about 10 years, and working with rulemaking and recently with the appeals board on their efforts in the stakeholder meetings. And Mr. Monning, as you pointed out earlier, the mission of CalOSHA is to protect workers from safety hazards and to adjudicate appeals in fair and timely manner. But also CalOSHA is a program, and it consists of all the parts and pieces, and they have to work together in order to reach the right conclusion. And that's, you have to look at the development of the regulations. Are they enforceable? Can employers comply with them? How are they interpreted? And then how are they enforced? And then the appeals process. And it has to be looked at as a whole system. We've worked extensively and cooperatively with the division and with the standards board on many projects over the years. We have an enormous amount of respect for the work that they do, both on the division side, the standards board, along with the appeals board. We also appreciate that Ms. Traeger has invited stakeholders to the table to bring our ideas and our suggestions and to have open discussions. It's been very fruitful. Last year, this sort of started last year in response to AB 1988, which was the bill that would encourage abatement appeals that had abatement issues to be expedited, so that the safety hazards would be taken care of and employees wouldn't be exposed to those hazards throughout the process. And this pilot project, worked very well. Everyone was pretty happy about it. The board has now begun to draft regulations. We've seen a proposal to put this into their regulations, and we commend that. We've made comments on it, and we hope to see that as a regular, permanent program here pretty soon. We started out with these discussions last year, and we moved quickly to rulemaking when we realized that some of these ideas that we had needed to go into regulations and couldn't be done administratively. One thing that we did discover in this process that was shocking, absolutely shocking, is that we found areas where labor and management agreed.
Could be a model. Who knows?
It was really actually a lot of fun.
We signed. This could be a real break.
You've seen the letter. It was signed by myself on behalf of Cal Chamber and my colleagues on the business side, and Jeremy Smith of the Labor Federation and the colleagues on the labor side. We signed that
Jeremy saying it was
together. And the division agreed with those proposals as well. At our last stakeholder meeting with the board, we had a lot of discussion about those proposals. We found a lot of areas of agreement with the board on those proposals, and we're very hopeful that we'll see some positive steps come out of that in rulemaking soon. So we think that we found a lot of common ground. It was a very fruitful discussion. So we appreciate the rulemaking process. We can all work together in an interactive manner with all the stakeholders and really come to good, workable solutions. This process is just getting started, really. You know, nothing happens very quickly in rulemaking. We hope that we will have the time and opportunity to continue this process and really develop some fruitful and important changes in the regulations with the board. So my panel here today, I'll introduce both of them, and then Mr. Peterson will go first, and then Mr. Bland will follow up. So first of all, Mr. Robert Peterson, he's a very well-respected and longtime attorney dealing with Cal OSHA matters, representing employers in appeals since 1978. When the Cal OSHA program was established in 1974, Mr. Peterson was its first chief counsel and assisted in the creation and implementation of the appeals board procedures. So he's got a pretty good handle on what all these procedures are. He remained with the appeals board until 1978, and now he practices not only in the California courts but also in federal courts and throughout the country in both state and federal OSHA proceedings. He's also co-authored a number of books and articles on OSHA. Mr. Bland, Kevin Bland, is with the law firm of Hines, Smith, Carter, Denzel, Bland. Did I get them all right?
I think so.
Okay.
Just get his name.
Yeah, just get the last name right. We're good.
The Bland, yes. In Orange County. Kevin was an iron worker before he became an attorney, so he has a good mix of experience and background. And for almost 10 years, he's been working on Cal OSHA matters, not only representing employers in Cal OSHA appeals, but also working in rulemaking with the Standards Board, and has been active since the beginning in the advisory meetings with the appeals board. So with that.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher. Welcome, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Bland. We appreciate you joining us this morning.
We enjoy the opportunity to be here. I would agree that with Len Welch, who I've known for 25 or 30 years, that this is sort of, I'm not sure it'd go quite as far as it is a historic moment, but it is a significant matter. I would completely agree with Len that the employer community has become engaged in these matters. There's a lot of reasons for that, of course. As Marty indicated, we've represented a lot of employers for a lot of years around the country, and my experience has been nobody wants anybody injured. There's just not, I don't know of any employers that I've ever represented that wants injuries. So they really are committed to this. I think the last probably 10 or 15 years, the construction industry, which is really what OSHA is all about, when you clear away all the smoke, it's really the construction industry where we have accidents and so forth. They have just turned an entirely different mindset to this program in terms of not having problems. I would also agree with Len that California, without question in my mind, is the best run OSHA program in the country. I'm all over. I live in Plains. I go to Alaska, to Guam, to Virginia, whatever, and so I'm constantly traveling. And there are about 25 states that are Fed OSHA states. They just are not as well run as Cal OSHA. Certainly we have some problems. It's a huge program out here, so naturally you're going to have some differences of opinion, but it's well run. It's a leader. For example, with this heat illness standard, you know, the federal government, it'll take them years, literally, to adopt a heat illness standard that Len and his people were able to accomplish in no time. So they're definitely a leader in I happen to disagree with that standard, and I'm hoping to get it thrown out in an appellate court, but that doesn't mean that he didn't do a good job. And as you know, we had Fed OSHA out here from 87 to 89. When Duke Majan defunded the program, Fed OSHA came in and took it over. There was nobody here. There were no Fed OSHA inspectors, you know, just none. And so, you know, when people shake and rattle this Fed OSHA symbol, it makes me a little anxious because I know how I deal with them every day somewhere, and we did in those 2 years. So I do have a couple of comments. So I think that understandably, I would disagree somewhat with Len in terms of these issues, for example, of amendments. There is a board rule now that says, look, if you've got an amendment you want to make, let everybody know 20 days before the hearing. That's all you have to do is file an amendment 20 days before the hearing. And then the employer, it's usually filed by the division, naturally, as you might expect. And an employer then has some time to digest what the change is, to see if, well, are we going to change our defenses here? Should we try to settle the case? And I don't know. I hear all these numbers, and I immediately fell asleep in the back of the room. we settle probably 70-80% of all the cases that we file. There's no law firm in the state, I think, that does more of this than we do, and there's only 4 or 5 of us. We settle almost everything. And the reason you do that is risk, whichever side you're on. You never know what a judge is going to do. So if you can settle a case that your client's happy with, that's probably the first reason you're going to do it. You're going to settle it. And secondly, you know what you've got. And so we don't waste time. I do seminars every spring around the state on how to comply with OSHA, for heaven's sakes. We don't like to waste time. If we've got a problem, we accept it, we deal with it, and we get on with life. So I don't know about all these settlement terms and everything and all these numbers. All I know is we settle the way big majority of our cases on what's fair to us, to my client, at least as I see it. And I think the division people do the same thing. Their lawyers are very competent people. And so but I am a little concerned about this issue about amendments. I won't take a lot longer here and that is, if you're going to propose, OSHA has 6 months to issue a citation. 6 months from the date of the alleged violation. Sometimes it takes that long. Mm-hmm. And then, I know that the appeals board has really shortened that appeal time, but even at a shortened appeal time, it's going to be 7 or 8 months before you get to a hearing. And then you walk into the hearing that morning, and the division makes a motion to amend the citation. And you're thinking, gee, you've had this citation for over a year. Now you want to change the citation? I got people here who are going to address what was charged. That's not due process of law. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. We're all concerned about safety. Nobody wants anybody hurt. I mean, nobody's like that. I've never known anybody like that. But it's got to be fair both ways. The only other thing I'd address just quickly is this serious violation. That's a slippery slope, and I'll tell you why. Fed OSHA, their position is, and they issue all the citations are serious. They've hated Cal OSHA for all these years because Cal OSHA has I think the last quarter they accounted for only 19% of the citations issued were serious. And the high number I think was like 27%. That was a couple of years ago. Fed OSHA hates that. And I'm sure they're critical of OSHA, Cal OSHA, in every annual review. They're critical. We don't issue enough serious violations. The difference is, though, in California, which I think is a good thing, frankly, for everybody's standpoint, is if you go to a hearing and you can't prove it serious, for whatever reason, the employer didn't know, or there's not a substantial probability of death or whatever, the division can't prove it, or, we can prove that we didn't know it existed, it could still be a general violation. It doesn't mean the violation goes away. It ends up being a general violation, which means the employer has to fix it. So you get the correction taken. Even if you litigate it, and if you lose, then, and frankly, most of the time the clients I represent have fixed it already anyway, but it's very rare that abatement is an issue. Maybe in a noise case where you're not sure you've got some machines that are making parts that are noisy, you're not sure how to cut the noise down, and so you have an abatement issue. But that's not usually the issue in these hearings, at least all thousands of hearings we've had. But with the feds, the difference is that if you can prove that it was not serious, the whole violation goes away. The whole violation. You walk out of there without anything. And I think that's wrong. I don't think that's a good policy. I think that the policy here in California is better. So even if the citation goes from serious to general, if it's upheld as general, the employer still has to fix it. And that's really what we're all after, I think anyway, is making sure that nobody's hurt again. So I think so. Again, with that whole business of definitions and serious this and serious that, you got to be careful where you go with that, because if we were to go like the feds went, then, and as I say, if you can prove it's not serious, the whole thing goes away, and I'm not so sure that's where we want to be. Well, anyway, that's just kind of my experience.
Great. Well,
with these cases.
Mr. Peterson, thank you. I think we're going to hold questions till we get through the panels, so we'll now go to Mr. Bland. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Money, Chairman. I want to first echo something that Lynn had mentioned earlier, Mr. Welsh had mentioned earlier about the stakeholder process and the discussion process. I think that's really going to be the key and continues to be the key to a successful program here. And in front of whether it's the appeals board or the standards board or whatever arm of the division OSHA it is, because if we look at, I think, the monumental event, I know he didn't agree with historical, but the fact that we had labor and management and the division, for that matter, I think, all in agreement on several proposals and consensus on some things that were fairly difficult to wrestle with. And, for example, the one of continuances, because it was affecting everyone in the process. And it was a procedural matter, of course. And the one thing that we had talked about earlier is the opportunity to give some guidance. We know that continuances are issued on good cause, but for a lot of the general public that doesn't practice in front of the appeals board, because it's not always an attorney representing an employer in these matters, they need some guidance as to what maybe good cause is. And I think with the continuance proposal, we put some factors in there, some things to consider and some things to give some guidance, which I think that we're getting close to that being implemented into the board process, we hope. I know that Ms. Traeger and having the advisory committee meetings on that, I think we've made some headway, especially after the last meeting. Another point that I think has been addressed, and then a proposal had been made that takes into maybe some of those changes that have been made already with the scheduling of hearings. I know it's difficult to be in two places at once for anyone, or having more than 2 or 3 hearings for the same district manager or the same attorney. I think those have been addressed by the appeals board already, and also in the proposal that's jointly presented to the appeals board for the rulemaking. So I think that's some progress and some things that are positive that are coming out of this. Another, I think, important thing that's been discussed, I guess, throughout is the settlement issue. And I know Bob had gone into it, but I think one thing that's been kind of left out that I don't know is clear, and forgive me if it is, the settlement, in my experience, that's reached with the division. The division counsel and myself, in my case, or the employer and the district manager, will come up with what they believe is a reasonable resolution of what the citations are during the appeal process, and then they take that proposal and submit that to the appeals board for approval of that. So it really isn't the appeals board that's making that settlement. It's the division and the employer that says, here's what we believe the outcome is going to be, and this is going to be a fair outcome without having to litigate it. Maybe some cases, I've never agreed to something that I didn't think was pretty close to what the outcome would be, and I think the division probably prescribes to that. There's different pressures that may go into entering into a settlement, and everyone has those and everyone makes those considerations. But in the end, it's really the appeals board that approves it, but the agreement itself is entered into. And I don't know that that was cleared. And I agree with Bob, I don't think that settlement is a bad thing, because at the end, I think both parties end up with what they believe is a fair outcome without having to spend the time and the expense on both ends of going through an entire hearing process to get to the same outcome. Another thing that I think has been very positive that has come out of this is this expedited abatement program, or expedited hearing program to address abatement. For my constituents and my employers, I represent several construction associations. Our interest, and I think Mr. Monahan had mentioned this earlier, is what do you do with the guys that aren't complying, right? So for us, it's a very positive thing if we get our competitors to abate when we have bid the project to include all the safety requirements that there are, and rather than wait that process out. So with that, when that becomes effective, and I think it is becoming effective, that's going to be beneficial for employees and beneficial for employers across the board. And I think it's another very positive outcome that has come from these discussions and this process thus far. So it's my hope that we continue to have the opportunity to have open forum stakeholder discussions, work with labor and the division of management and the appeals board to get systems and get procedures and get things in place that it may not be something that everyone likes, but everyone can understand the process and everyone can know what the rules are and as they follow them.
Thank you, Mr. Blandon. Again, we'll open it up and see if my co-chair has any questions. I did want to just follow up with a couple quick questions. One, I just want to comment again on the reference to your clients who are making every effort to be in compliance and are getting perhaps underbid by underground economy, people that aren't playing by the rules. And I do think that is an area where I look forward to cooperation that can bring together employer associations, labor organizations, and the enforcement agencies. And that's where we should be pushing. And as part of that enforcement, the key to that is to protect worker health and safety for the most vulnerable. So thank you for your reference to that. I don't know if this is a fair question for you, Mr. Peterson, but I guess we can ask anything we want.
And he will answer it any way he wants.
Yeah, and I'm afraid you will, but I'm going to throw you this softball anyway. You're an attorney by training. You've been at this for a long time. When a statute is constructed to say may impose a penalty not less than $5,000, how do you read that?
I'd have to have the language of the statute in front of me.
Mm-hmm. It's spoken like a true lawyer. Well, maybe we can continue that conversation. I am referring, of course, to this holding. Thank you. Jeremy's got a labor code. Let's. Why don't you read it to us when you're up here on the panel? Thanks.
Another partnership.
Another partnership, yeah. But again, this is the Callaway decision, and we'll be talking about this further, but it's the board taking upon itself reinventing the law. And that's one of our concerns up here, is that where does precedent apply, how are statutes interpreted? And again, I'm testifying a little bit up here, not really looking for your affirmation of that. It's just a concern, and you've had experience both with the board and establishing it, and I recognize and respect that contribution and continuing to work in the arena. So I just think for employers and employees, this question of predictability is critical, and we have a system of laws that is built on precedent. We give discretion to ALJs and how they weight the credibility of testimony and evidence. We talked about this with experts, but I think we do need, in the interpretation of law, statute, and precedent, some consistency in the board. So,
just two quick things, actually three quick things. The administrative law judges, Cal OSHA judges, are the best I've seen in the country. They're not biased. And remember, they deal with maybe the same OSHA inspector 3 or 4 times a month. And yet, notwithstanding that fact, they're not biased, and I think they're bright, and I think they're hardworking. I think the ALJs here, way better than work comp. You know, we do a little work in work comp. That's just a wacky area. And I'm not so sure that those judges are even should be judges, but that's neither here nor there. It's not why we're here today. The judges are very good. I think what did Candace say, 8 or 9 or 10, whatever it is. They're very good. They've always been good. I've never sensed any bias. But on the penalty issue, way back when we wrote a decision called Candle Rock, that may have been back in the early 70s, and we said, well, the board has authority to reduce fines, you know, because that's what we said. You know, they've got some decision authority here. Now, I know that the one you're talking about, this $5,000 thing, I was kind of under the impression that's kind of become a moot issue, only because the board has issued a recent decision after reconsideration. Remember what the name was? Trader Dan's, that says, hey, look, and here's the thing. Even now, I get calls from somebody. Sometimes they're big employers. Sometimes they're not. Well, we told our work comp carrier, and they said, don't worry, we'll call OSHA. Or the fire department said, and this happens every day, they said, don't worry, we'll call OSHA. And so they don't call them. Now, that's probably still, maybe that justifies a fine of some amount, but that's, to me, a far different cry from just trying to avoid notifying OSHA completely, which I'm sure happens. And so, you know, in that regard, it seems to me that the board should have some authority to say, you know what, they reported it was a day late or 2 days late. Sometimes you can't get the information from the hospital, whether a guy's even been hospitalized, so you don't know you have to even report it or not. But I think so. I think the board has to have some authority in that regard to just not slam a $5,000 fine because you're an hour late.
Yeah. Well, I agree.
That's all I'm saying about that.
I appreciate that. I agree for the importance of flexibility and adaptability. By the same token, there are certain policy issues that are established by the legislature and not subject to being thrown out the window by any board. And your comments on workers' comp, we'll take that as a suggestion to maybe expand this oversight to worker comp as well. But let me turn to co-chair Mr. Desaulnier, see if you have any questions.
I just want to comment on it's a beautiful thing. And seriously, it does seem like it is troubling to have these hearings because I think everybody agrees with what Mr. Peterson said. We go back to root cause. If we can avoid somebody getting work, that's what we want. Getting hurt, that's what we want to do. That's in everyone's best interest. So it's a little frustrating arguing about these other things. So hopefully the stakeholder process will continue to be as successful as it has been for everybody because it's in everyone's best interest. A kumbaya moment.
And I want to thank you for your presentations this morning and for your work, and I look forward to our future collaboration on the underground economy issues that we talked about. Thank you.
Thank you.
And at this point, we'd like to invite our final panel before public comment, worker advocates. If you'd please come forward. Welcome. I appreciate your patience as members of the final panel here, but you have the benefit of having heard the testimony that's preceded you. So in your comments, you should feel free to acknowledge or address any of the prior testimony that you've heard. And as with our prior panel, I'll ask you to just introduce yourself, your affiliation for the record, and I think we'll hold questions until each panel member's had a chance to speak. So, Mr. Smith, would you like to commence?
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Jeremy Smith here on behalf of the California Labor Federation. I had a nice, neat, typed sheet at the beginning of this hearing. That's what I get for going last. I got all kinds of notes and arrows on this now. I have lots to say about what's been said today already. First of all, let me just start with something that affects everybody. I don't want to forget to say this. We've been saying this in lots of committee hearings. It's this issue of furloughs. DOSH is a non-general funded entity in the state, yet they are subject to the furloughs. You have inspectors not working 3 days a month. You have appeals board staff not working similarly because they're made to. Candace is right when she says that staff at the appeals board, and Len didn't say it, but I think you would agree that staff at DOSH want to work and want to keep moving forward on cases, and they can't. So I would just urge the governor to rescind this furlough edict for non-general funded employees. DOSH is funded by a user fee, and whether the general fund is in the red or not, workers still get injured at work, and they need to be out there, inspectors need to be out there enforcing the laws. So that being said, let me get into some appeals board specific stuff. First of all, a few good things with caveats. Since the last oversight hearing, we have seen some good. We've seen some scheduling changes. I didn't personally see a schedule with non-overbooked inspectors until Mr. Pacheco's first Rules Committee hearing in August. So it took him a while. I've been told that it's calendaring issues, computer issues, whatever, but it took him a while to change the calendar. But it has slowly changed. Now, I've been told in appeals board meetings that this is subject to review if another backlog occurs. We don't want a backlog. Nobody wants a backlog. We're glad there's a minimal backlog and that the backlog actually went away at one point. However, no backlog at the expense of overscheduling DOSH inspectors for 2 or 3 hearings at the same time on the same day with the same judge. That's not going to work either. There's a happy medium there, perhaps. So I would hope that moving forward, Ms. Traeger does not scrap the scheduling changes. She hasn't said that she's going to, but she has said that as the numbers come in, we'll need to revisit it. That's fine. Let's keep up the conversation, but let's remember that there is no backlog like there was when Candace got there. A little backlog, I would argue, isn't the worst thing in the world. We don't want a backlog like it was when she came in, but we don't want to, not literally, but kill the inspectors with work. Secondly, the advisory committee process. I've been out here for 5 years doing this with the Labor Federation, and I've participated in numerous advisory committees with Len Welsh at DOSH, and they're wonderful. They're great. We're happy that they exist, and we're glad that Candace is doing them. It's a new thing for the board. We appreciate her doing that. I have to acknowledge that. Art Carter, the newest member of the board, he's a good thing. No caveats there. We're glad he's there. We're glad Senator Steinberg helped get him there. The abatement pilot project, good. We had a good conversation a few weeks ago. We're looking forward to seeing regulations to put that into place. Abatement is a big issue. Bad employers can appeal, and they don't have to abate, period, and workers can stay unsafe. So we're glad there's a project. I guess we'll stop calling it a project, but we're glad they're going to put into place what the project was moving forward. We look forward to seeing the final regs on that. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the $5,000 penalty issue. Ms. Traeger said earlier today that they love guidance. That's a direct quote. They welcome guidance from you, Mr. Monning and Senator DeSaulnier. The problem is, it seems like they love their own guidance most of all. They did not come back to us, to anybody here, Mr. Swanson, any labor chair previous, Mr. Koretz, Mr. Alarcon, to seek guidance on 6409.1. They didn't. We would have been in that committee, we would have been in that policy hearing, and they didn't do it. They decided instead to issue decisions after reconsideration. The Callaway case in July 2006 is the key decision here. We don't believe that's the way to do things. This is a policy discussion that we need to have in a policy committee before the legislature. We don't need to issue DARs and stretch legal thinking to point to other labor code sections that the appeals board used to get them off the hook for having to do this. Could the code be clearer? I'll have that discussion with anybody. Perhaps it could, but we need to have it here, not issued in a backroom way at a closed meeting of the appeals board, the business meeting where they deal with decisions after reconsideration in cases. It needs to be discussed openly. This is a penalty meant to ensure that other workers don't get hurt. That's it. Everybody in this room knows that was the reason Senator Steinberg passed the bill. We want to make sure DOSH hears from employers when there's an injury at a workplace. You can talk all you want about it being vague and not well written, but we all know what the point of it is. And it's inane to think that it's not clear. It's clear. It's clear. Could we do some language to clear it up and make it better? Maybe. Do we want to tier it? By tier, I mean T-I-E-R. If an employer drives the hospital drives a worker to the hospital or goes in the ambulance, stays with them, is told they're going to get called, or the ambulance paramedic's going to call, or the firefighter's going to call. All right, I'm not here to say it needs to be something that's $5,000 or nothing, but right now it is $5,000 or nothing, and bad employers use this as a loophole to not call, and it needs to be changed. It needs to be changed in sunlight before a policy committee. I stepped out for a minute to take a call when Ledge Counsel came up here, and I came back and he was done on the $5,000 penalty issue. I thought I had a few minutes. I think it's important to read from their opinion. However, where the language, quote, where the language of a statutory provision is susceptible of two constructions, one which would render it reasonable, fair, and in harmony with its manifest purpose, and the other which would lead to absurd consequences, the former construction must be adopted. People versus Superior Court. One more, just for the record. The Callaway interpretation of sections 6409.1 and 6602 renders a statutory minimum of section 6409.1 meaningless, because the board is free under that interpretation to abandon the restriction when hearing an appeal from a decision by the division. It's clear, and I think SOR's research on this issue makes it even more clear. Board ALJs reduce non-reporting penalties 87.5% of the time. When board ALJs reduce penalties, they reduce penalties by at least 75% of the initial fine in over half of all relevant cases. Those are cases they looked at. It's clear. This is a penalty that needs to be enforced. If we need to change it, we need to change it. We'll come before the legislature to do that. Continuances. Let's get to some specific policies and procedures. I have a couple folks to my left, one of whom is a lawyer who will get a little more deeper into some of the stuff I'm going to raise moving forward, but it's worth me just scratching the surface here as a non-lawyer. Continuances. This is something that affects employers and DOSH. Somebody's mother dies. Somebody's got to sit for the bar. Somebody's sick. These are real examples where the appeals board refused a continuance. If that happens and a case is dismissed, how is there justice? Sure, there's due process and parties before a case aren't prejudiced, but if you don't give a continuance for a legitimate reason, employers get off the hook and workplaces stay unsafe because somebody can't put on their case. Or an employer can't put on his or her case and get out from underneath onerous citations. We heard Mr. Welsh say that sometimes his inspectors oversight. Well, an employer should have due process, able to argue why that shouldn't have happened. If he can't get a continuance to do that, he can't do that either. That's just not right. Mr. Monty, you raised expert testimony. This is another just crazy thing that Michael Smith will get into deeply, but these are IHs at DOSH who have done thousands of inspections, safety engineers who have seen thousands of violative conditions. And there have been ALJs who have actually said, you haven't done 20 of these inspections. You haven't seen 20 falls off of a ladder from 17 or 18 feet. Your testimony, Mr. DOSH inspector, is moot. Really. That's just crazy to me, and it doesn't make any sense. And I think we can all agree in this room, if you fall off a ladder at 17 or 20 feet, you're going to be hurt, and it's a serious situation. There are other things, getting nailed by a nail gun. That's come up before and been tossed out in expert testimony. Venue and video testimony. These are going through subjects that we put forth as regulatory change from one of our letters last October. 70% over 8 quarters of hearings were heard in just 3 locations in the state. That's from the Senate Office of Research. That's just looking at the calendar and counting up the different cities that are out there, more or less. That's not right. The statute says hearings must happen as close as practicable to where the violative condition occurred. It's not happening. There's furloughs. I mentioned those earlier. There's budgetary constraints. Fine. But there are ways that you can hold hearings in other places, and one of those, video testimony. This is something that civil courts, criminal courts have used a lot. The NLRB does it, not very often. I think we could all agree it's better when a witness is in person at a hearing, but sometimes it just can't happen because they can't get away from work. They travel to one of the 3 venue sites that have been used over the last 8 quarters because they can't take a day off work because they need to get paid. That happens often in the Central Valley with the farm workers. So these are 2 areas where I think that we can work with the stakeholders in the advisory committee process and come to an agreement. We've been talking about these issues, and we may be getting close to something. But we need to keep talking, and we need to acknowledge that there's an issue here and that there are limits to what we can do with the budget, but I think we could do better with the money we have, or the appeals board could do better with the money they have in holding cases. And then there's another issue that Ms. Traeger has raised in advisory committee meetings, and that's the issue of holding hearings at DOSH or DLSE buildings. She said that she was worried about, she didn't use the word scaring, but scaring employers, scaring employer counsel. Having it seem too heavy-handed to have your case heard at a DOSH building that, DOSH is there working every day. I think this is nonsense, frankly. I think that these are professional attorneys, and they've practiced in many venues I don't think they're going to be afraid to go to a DOSH building to have a hearing. If it means we can have a hearing in Fresno, which they've started to do, or Bakersfield, I think that is more important than scaring an employer or an employer attorney when they're holding a hearing. The entire DOSH Act, it could be argued, is meant to scare employers to do the right thing, because not all employers do the right thing. There are thousands and thousands of good employers out there, but there are just as many, if not more, bad employers who want to game the system and try and get by. And they should be scared, and they should feel that the weight of the state upon them if they have to try a case or they appeal something frivolously. I've been going on for a little bit here. I'll try and wrap up. I apologize for going so long. I have a couple more points to make. The previous panel, which I will say I've been happy to work with Marty and Kevin on this language. I want to acknowledge that we've had excellent conversations on things. We've come to some agreement on some things. We're still talking about other things, but I believe that it's good to talk to the other side. I wish we could do that more often. Some of our issues are religious. We just aren't going to come to an agreement on some issues. We just can't talk about everything. But where we can talk about things, we should, and we are, and I appreciate that, and I want to thank Len Welsh for drawing us together to do that. He's hosted some conference calls and some meetings, and it's been fruitful and refreshing. We have a ways to go, though. But I will say the previous committee or panel said talked about settlements. I will agree that settlements aren't bad per se. It helps move the docket along. It helps rid cases from the backlog. But if, and you mentioned it, Mr. Monning, if the policies and procedures of the board lead to settlements, lead to whittling down of penalties, that's not right. And we contended a year ago that many of the procedures that the appeals board follows, like overscheduling, for example, lack of venue, lead DOSH inspectors to reach a settlement on something they may wanted to fight on if they had more time, but they just can't because they've got more cases. Or an employer, if they can't get a continuance, they got to settle sometimes. Maybe the continuance is legitimate. Maybe somebody died in their family and they need it, but it wasn't granted. They're forced to settle. That's not right either. It's both sides of the ledger. I'm up here talking for employers right now. It affects them too. So settlements are not bad per se, but when the way of doing business leads to settlements, that's not right. We believe stout and enforced penalties are the only way to keep workplaces the most safe. Try as they might, try as Marty might, try as Kevin Bland, they can't represent all of the employers in this state. There are some employers that just aren't going to want to be represented before the appeals board. They're going to, obfuscate. They're going to stall. They're going to try and get out of their penalties. And they know that they can do that. They can get away with that. Stout penalties and that are enforced are the best deterrent, in our opinion, for keeping workplaces safe. And we are afraid, particularly around the $5,000 reporting penalty, but other issues too, that's not happening. We understand the need to get through the backlog. They need to do business a certain way. But now that we're through the backlog, we need to start looking at ways to do business before the appeals board that effectuates real good case law and real penalties that are enforced. I think I'll finish there. I'll say one more thing, though. I hope we have another oversight hearing. I want to just publicly ask for that. I know Senator DeSaulnier isn't here right now. I believe that the oversight hearing in and of itself is a good way to keep things moving forward. The specter of it on the horizon, knowing that we're going to have to come back and talk about where we've gotten over the last 6, 9, 10 months, I think is an important tool. And I would hope that we could, after the elections this year, after November passes, maybe we could have another one of these when we all catch our breath from the election and talk about where we've come over the last 10 months. Because Candace is right, Ms. Traeger is right. We have several advisory committees scheduled over this year. And I hope we can get to some agreement on some language. I think it would be good for the labor committees to see where we are at the end of the year, early next year, and see if we need to do more legislatively to move the process along. So I'll stay up here at the table for questions. That's all I have now. I want to pass it over to Michael Smith from WorkSafe.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for your comprehensive testimony, and I appreciate your advocacy on behalf of employers as well. I do want to turn to our other Mr. Smith, and we'll hold questions until we get through the whole panel. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Chairman Monning. I am Michael Smith. I'm a lawyer with WorkSafe, and I'm here to present testimony about certain areas of board decisions that have concerned us at WorkSafe in our review of those decisions over the past 5 years. I first want to address, before I get into my memos that I passed out, the issue of amendments at the time of a board hearing or a hearing before an ALJ. Most courts, including in California and other administrative venues, do allow more liberal amendment of pleadings than are currently allowed in the appeals board. The issue is due process, and if a change can be made that allows due process to the employer who is having a citation changed against him at the time of hearing, if that can be made in a fair way, whether that be by allowing the employer extra time to prepare, or if there's simply not enough change for it to be unfair to the employer, then it'll just go ahead in those other venues. And I think that we should look at adopting something really similar before the appeals board. With respect to the memo, the one I'd like to address first is the one that's 4 pages, 2 pages front and back, and I'll go in order in those cases. The first area of concern that we have is when the board has required expert testimony of matters that are either common knowledge or could be easily inferred by the ALJ hearing the case. As a lawyer, as a lawyer not practicing normally before the appeals board, it's a little bit esoteric for me to hear the description of how how violations are actually proved before the appeals board. But you can't just present evidence that there was a 17-foot fall, for example, resulting in injury, and have that speak for itself. The appeals board rules currently require, or the way that they interpret the law currently requires, that there be expert testimony about the likely results of a 17-foot fall. I agree with Mr. Welsh. I think that that's a waste of time. I think that there should be a set of presumptions with regard to falls from a certain height. That was the case, or the case in which that came up was the first one mentioned, control air conditioning. Similarly, Jeremy stole my thunder, but the Jocon construction case from 2006 was the case involving a nail gun, in which the board, in its decision, faulted the testimony of the DOSH inspector who had been inspecting construction sites for 10 years, but had not previously investigated a case involving a similar nail gun. I mean, so what we're looking at is the board is requesting or demanding something along the lines of a ballistics expert to testify to how likely it is that you're going to sustain a serious injury when you get shot with a 3-inch nail. And so I think that would be another area in which there could be a presumption, or in which the board could simply take, or the judge could simply take judicial notice. The next area I'd like to talk about relates to a theme that was hit on by some earlier speakers, which is the board's narrow construction of regulations designed to protect the health and safety of workers. The first case, and most notable, that I'd like to talk about is the J.F. Shea case, in which there was a tunneling operation going on. There was a blast, which could potentially put workers at risk from debris or from the blast itself. The regulation requires that a warning signal be given. The appeals board found that a signal was given, and even though that signal was not heard by the workers who were potentially at risk, that was good enough. And so our point here is that the regulations must be construed so that they have some meaning. And if it's not even required that the employees who are at risk hear that warning signal, then that undermines and guts the purpose of the regulation. And so if you go back to the Carmona case, which dealt with the short-handled hose back in 1975, that case talked about liberally construing safety regulations for the purpose of achieving a safe working environment, and that's what should have been done in that J.F. Shea case. And that was a 2007 case in which Chairwoman Traeger and Member Pacheco participated. The next case, I really don't have to talk about too much about the Bill Calloway case that's already been hit by a number of speakers. Our view is that that's another example of the board not considering itself bound by statutory law. And, the statute's in black and white. I do commend the board on a recent decision in which it actually increased the penalty for an employer who failed to report an injury, and actually that was an employer who took steps to conceal its actions. The board actually increased the penalty to $7,000. But until that case, the board has treated the language in 6409.1 that says not less than as if it said not more than. Words have to have meaning. Really briefly, I want to talk about the United Airlines case. That case deals with personal protective equipment, gloves for baggage handlers working for United Airlines. In that case, the board actually went out of its way to reweigh the testimony or reweigh the evidence, which is the job of the administrative law judge, and discredit several witnesses who testified about the risks that they faced from handling baggage. Again, narrowly construing or taking a very, very narrow view of regulations that are designed to protect workers. The reweighing of evidence also took place in the Bay Area Systems and Solutions case. The administrative law judge found that a worker who was electrocuted was doing a particular job installing a Scotch lock and was not knowingly working outside of his job duties. The board came in, reweighed the evidence, did the job of the ALJ, and found that he was installing a light fixture, and somehow the board determined that he knowingly was working outside of his job duties. The penalty reduction in that case, the ALJ had found a $16,000 penalty and a serious violation. The board reduced it to a general violation and the penalty down to $335. And so when Mr. Peterson talks about there not being much of a difference between a serious and a general, or between a general still being a victory for workers, it's much less so when you're talking about 2% of the original penalty. Continuing with the theme of the board rewriting or simply ignoring statutory law is the Harris construction case. Confession, I'm a lawyer with WorkSafe, and we're actually in litigation over that case that's at the Superior Court right now. Our view is that the board simply ignored the statutory language and read additional requirements into 6400B3 of the Labor Code. That section required that for an employer to be a controlling employer, they need only be responsible for health and safety on a work site through contract or through actual practice. That applies to most general contractors. The board's interpretation narrows significantly the application of that statutory law to a subset of general contractors. The board then followed its Harris construction case in Hearn Construction. So even though the contractor in Hearn Construction had the contractual authority to inspect the scaffolding that was deficient, the board found that that this employer was not responsible, despite its undertaking responsibility to inspect that scaffolding in a written document. One theme that hasn't been talked about too much today is the issue of amending case names. The next case there is Kimes Morris Construction. In that case, there was renovation work being done in a building. Kimes Morris Construction was the contractor. It so happened that Mr. Kimes and Mr. Morris were also part owners of the building. When the inspector came out and did the inspection, the owner, one of the contractors, told the inspector that he was actually part building owner. The citation that was dismissed by the board pertained to a building owner's duties to inform employees and others about the presence of asbestos. Despite the same people being the building owner and the contractor, and the citation going out toward toward this employer, Kimes Morris Construction, the board dismissed that violation rather than allowing DOSH to amend the citation, or rather than applying the citation to that entity that actually owned the building, which was in reality the same people as the contractors. The final point that I want to talk about is what we've called the arbitrary dismissal of citations. When we see a case that the division has found important enough to issue a citation on, that the employer found the citation serious enough to negotiate with and reach a settlement with the employer, but then that case ends up getting dismissed because either the parties don't communicate with the ALJ, or the ALJ understands that there's a settlement, but still leaves the matter on calendar and then dismisses it when the parties don't show up. That's a really bad result for us. People aren't getting protected on the job. It's in the public interest that cases be decided on the merits, or that cases be settled on the merits, rather than dismissed so abruptly. I urge the appeals board to treat settlements proactively, and when there is word of a settlement, they need to reach out, see what the terms are immediately, so that settlement can be processed, rather than dismissing the case. That doesn't help workers.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Catton.
Yes, good afternoon, Chairman. I'm Ann Catton from California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation. And just wanted to emphasize that in agriculture, it's particularly important to hold appeals hearings close to the work site, because it's unrealistic to expect agricultural workers who are seasonal workers to take extended time off of this scarce seasonal employment. And in addition, farm workers expect, like most workers, are going to feel intimidated going to a hearing, and if they have to go to a hearing in a distant urban area they're unfamiliar with, it's going to be even more intimidating, and they're going to be less likely to agree to be a witness. We do see it as a positive step that the appeals board has scheduled several hearings in Fresno, but the Central Valley is a very large area, and more hearings are needed in Fresno, and also some hearings somewhere in Kern County like Bakersfield, and Stockton needs to be retained as a hearing location so that workers don't have to go an unreasonable distance to a hearing. And where the venue can't be moved close enough, we do also support the concept of giving workers a choice of testifying by video conferencing. We were also extremely concerned to see in the Senate Offices of Research's analysis that half of the mandatory fine appeals, which the board accepted, that they reduced them by over 75%. And that mandatory minimum fine of $5,000 is particularly important in agriculture, because workers in agriculture feel very vulnerable, and they're not going to report a serious illness or injury or a fatality to the authorities if they happen to know how to do the reporting, which they often will not know. And in light of Ledge Counsel's opinion, we think it's very important for the appeals board to stop reducing these fines wholesale, that the law is clear the way they have interpreted it. Excuse me. Also, as has been mentioned a number of times, significant fines are needed to deter violations and save life and limb. And the current practice of overly narrow interpretation of serious violation, throwing out serious violations because an experienced OSHA inspector is not considered an expert. This removes the deterrence for future, and is a very serious problem. Excuse me, which is also reflected in some of the DIRs that Mr. Smith has discussed, and we think that that's a very serious problem that needs to be addressed. And Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Catton. And while your microphone is on, just wanted to follow up with you. Have you been able to participate in the stakeholder meetings?
I have to some extent. I had some scheduling problems, but they do seem helpful. I appreciate they.
And have there been other farm worker representatives at those meetings, if you know?
Well, one other CRLA representative came to one of them, but.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, any questions for this panel? I think, did you have something you wanted to add? Yes, please, Mr. Smith.
I had one more thing. I wanted to mention, I'm not going to talk about, but I wanted to mention the other memo that a colleague of mine wrote that I distributed regarding the board's narrow reading of an employer's requirement or obligation to provide personal protective equipment, how there are Supreme Court cases that deal with that, and how that's been narrowed in recent cases. And I also wanted to thank all the other WorkSafe staff who, with me, reviewed about 270 board decisions from the last 5 years.
Great. Well, I want to thank you. And also, Mr. Smith.
If you had a question, go ahead. I'll wait till you're done.
Not a question, but a comment, actually, and it's bringing it back to you. But let me just offer this observation because, Jeremy, you started with the observation of the impact of furloughs, reduction of staff who aren't supported by general fund. I think most of you are aware that the legislature has passed legislation subject to the governor's review and signature that would exempt from furloughs those employees who aren't being paid from the general fund. So we think that is an immediate opportunity. One size doesn't fit all, and that we should not be exempting employees who aren't supported through the general fund, who are enforcing safety standards, who are collecting revenues for the state, et cetera. So I appreciate you raising that. And please, if you had another comment.
Thank you for your leadership on that issue, too. I think, you know, the big gorilla in the room there is EDD in the UI system, right? And that's the example everybody always uses, and it's awful. But we appreciate you both for passing that bill, and hopefully the governor will review it, as you say, kindly say, and feel like he wants to sign it. Len and Candace spoke about the definition of serious earlier, and I wanted just to say one thing to both of you. When an employer gets a citation or gets in trouble with DOSH, it creates a record, almost like you would have a record if you were a criminal, if you robbed the bank, or that would follow you for a while. If they get a serious violation, that's a lot blacker of a mark on their record than a general violation. So, we heard earlier that, whether it's a serious or whether it's a general may not really matter. It does matter. It does matter when they bid for projects moving forward. It matters to the state of California if they're going to bid for a project to do work for the state. I think the state would want to know if somebody's had a serious violation on their record, and it's important that we get a definition of this that works so that it sticks on these bad employers and follows them around, as it should.
Well, again, I want to thank all of you for your participation here today, and I'm just going to offer a couple closing remarks and then ask Co-Chair DeSaulnier to wrap up if he has any final comments. Again, I just want to thank all of the panel members who presented, and starting with our first panel with representatives from the board and the division. And I do believe that this type of oversight, while it may present some level of discomfort or maybe even resentment among workers who are working very hard at all levels of the enforcement chain, I think it does inure to the benefit of the mission, and I hope that everyone embraces that is the purpose of this oversight. It is to protect worker health and safety. It is to make sure that fair standards are enforced fairly for all, for employers and for workers. In my experience, it is often unrepresented workers that are working in less than favorable conditions with employers who are not playing by the rules that we put people at greatest risk. And so I think through our concerted effort working together, coming out of this hearing, I've mentioned I would like to follow up with some questions to the division. I'd like to just keep the spirit of exchange of information. I want to applaud those developments and achievements of the stakeholder meetings, of clearing backlogs, et cetera. So I'm the first to recognize the forward progress, and we're moving from hopefully a foundation that is strong, working towards perfection. And while that's often elusive in our line of work, it should be the objective and the goal, particularly when it's worker health and safety. It's one employer cutting a corner or not providing correct safety equipment that can lead to tragedy. And those tragedies shouldn't be underestimated. And even as numbers go down, any workplace fatality affects more than just the workplace. It affects families. It affects breadwinners of families. And you can't work backwards. There's no remediation after the worst workplace incident, which is a fatality. So I think our shared objective is to prevent those worst cases and to work towards safer workplaces in a safer state. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Chairman DeSaulnier, for sharing this joint hearing with your Assembly colleagues today.
My pleasure, Mr. Monning. I wanted to share leadership. I did want to see if any member of the public wanted to speak at this time. All right, seeing no one. Well, thank you all. Just to reiterate what Mr. Monning said, appreciate everybody's involvement. We are going to continue to stay involved, both on the Senate side and on the Assembly side. And I think, sorry if it's redundant, but I think it needs to be said once again, our commonality is how to avoid accidents or injuries in the workplace. And if we do that at the root cause and we have safe working environments, then we won't have to go through this. In terms of the external and internal criticism of the organization, being an elected official for 20 years, I am familiar with personalized criticism, as we all are, with being part of an institution that has this amazing approval rating of 18% of Californians. I am not insensitive to that. However, I always said in the restaurant business, and I've said it in politics too, it's easy to get along with our biggest admirers, and there's lots of them up here. Much harder to get along with our critics. And I would just ask that the department and the board try to at least appear less defensive, no matter how legitimate they feel their emotions or feelings are about the unfairness of the criticism, because I think when we embrace our critics as humans and accept that they may have a point every once in a while, it certainly helps with the process, because I think ultimately we're all on the same page about the original comment about avoiding injuries in the workplace. So I will continue to be happy to work with the chair and her new, very much respected and esteemed board member, who's a good friend who I've known many years, and I hope the result of all this is that there'll be a better workplace for Californians. So thank you all.